welcome everyone to a new episode of Cinematic Realms. We're back after a couple of weeks. I'm your host, John Webster. With me, as always, is my trusty co-host, Jared. How have you been, Jared?
I've been good. I've been incredibly busy at work, so the past couple weeks didn't even not having the stream didn't really help me make much of a dent in that. But it was still it was the right time to kind of take a break, and I think that I hope you had a restful vacation. And going forward, I'm just excited to get back to it, especially because I just happened to know this while we were gone. We officially passed the 1 year mark of us doing this together. So that's
God. Yeah. That's so wild, but it's it's a sign of like, and this is not me reverting to my usual spiel of, oh, I'm so old. But no, but like time, man, it races by, and it just it does seem to get worse every passing year. Okay, so I guess this is my oh, I'm so old spiel, but like I was just thinking the other day, and I think about this from time to time, of like back to the days of being in school, and like the fact that summer vacation was like this, big, huge, epic, vacation away from, everything. And you were like, I'm free and I don't have to go back to school for a long time. And now you think, what is it, like 2.5, 3 months at most? And then you're back. It's like nowadays that wouldn't even register. So yeah, but yeah, a year, it's man, time flies. And, but yeah, we've done a lot of fun stuff in that year. And, and one of those things has been, over the past number of months, has been going through this trilogy, which I have to thank you for, because it's one of those series of films that I've wanted to watch for a long time and never really found the right time or the excuse to go ahead and watch them. And so it's been really nice to go through them, and also not to rush through them either, to go through a nice pace, and because they are three very, like, they're obviously connected, but they are each have their own individual flavors and things that they're doing, and we're just alluding to the movies, but let's just say it. Our discussion for today is Richard Linklater's Before Midnight, which is the third film in his Before trilogy. Which, trilogy? Question mark? Because it does feel like at the end of this film that they could definitely revisit this down the line. I know they didn't do it for the next 9 years, but I almost feel like, it would almost be kind of fitting, based on where this film leaves off on, that it might be a bigger gap of time before the next time we see the characters. I do want to say right off the bat that after, like, sort of cryptically, discussing this one with you, at the end of the last stream for Before Sunset, was trying to, like, I didn't want to know exactly what transpired in this movie, but I was, at the same time, you try and glean, like, am I in store for like a terribly, sad ending? And I was happy to see that, even though there's some difficulties in this film, and the characters are dealing with a lot of issues, it ultimately arrives at, they're still together, and they're, so so even though over the course of the film it's, they have a trying time, and ultimately, yeah, they're still together. And it's, it's still a good ending, and you know, until they eventually do reunite these characters and potentially rip our hearts out with something, we can at least be content in the knowledge that that Jesse and Céline are making it, you know. So, but yeah, I will say I know exactly what you meant when you sort of teed up this film, which was that for you, you felt it was probably the most well made, but Before Sunset was your personal favorite. And I probably land in the same place, because this one doesn't have the sort of soaring romanticism that
Mhm.
Before Sunset has, because this is dealing with the realism of, you know, after they've now been together for 9 years, of sort of dealing with issues, and so it's about making a real marriage work,
Mhm.
uh, and so and so just inherently I feel like it's the film that it had to be,
Mhm.
um, and I loved it a lot, uh, but yeah, I think that the middle film will probably be the one I revisit the most, just because I'm such a hopeless romantic. Um, but yeah, so that's where I sit with it. I really enjoyed the film. I thought the performances were brilliant. Uh, just, you know, a wonderful third chapter. It's, it, but I'm interested, you know, to hear, you know, like I'm trying to remember. I think we covered this in the last chat, but like at what point did you see? Had you seen the other two films when this one came out, and sort of your whole journey with it? I'd be interested to, you know, even if we've covered it before, you know, just hearing uh, a bit about that.
Yeah, so just to kind of quickly recount that. So I had not seen either Before Sunrise or Before Sunset at the time that this movie was being released, which this movie came out in 2013. Um, I had heard of them, but you know, I would have been a little bit too young when Before Sunrise came out. Before Sunset, I was, you know, I kind of had different things I was looking for in the movies. But when I was reading about this movie in the lead up to it and reading, you know, reviews, in particular, one critic, Drew McWeeney's account of the movie from, I believe, where it premiered at the film festival, um, it it really got me interested in watching the entire series. So at that point, I went back and watched Before Sunrise and then Before Sunset. And then Before Midnight, shortly after it was released. And even though I didn't watch them all like back to back to back, you know, there was like a week or two in between each one. It was more of a compressed time frame. So for me, like I never had the full experience of just sitting with Before Sunrise or Before Sunset or Before Midnight, or like all as individual films with the 9 years if you would have gotten if you'd watched them, you know, as they came out. So I always knew that they were a trilogy and that they would have this kind of relationship to each other. But I also found myself just incredibly moved by the individual stories of each film. And when I've mentioned that this movie is probably, I think, the best crafted of the three, but it might be the one that I had the least personal connection to, there were a couple reasons for that. One being that, you know, the characters are a little bit older in this movie. They have kids, and this movie deals a lot with, you know, the relationship and how kids can change a relationship. And as someone who doesn't have kids yet, I hope to one day. That was something that like I can understand that more from the you know, from the perspective of seeing from it through the eyes of my parents, but I can't, you know, relate to the strain that children would put on a romantic relationship in that way. But this movie does it so well that it makes, you know, it makes that feel that immediate, even though it's like, the first movie really, as Ethan Hawke sums up, said the first movie is about, what might be, the possibility of this connection between Jesse and Céline. The second movie is about what could be or should be, having lost that connection, that moment in time, but then getting the opportunity to reconnect. And we talked about that extensively last week, that it was really a movie about when you get, what was lost can once again be found. And that, given where I am in my life, is the thing that I found the most immediately relatable and beautiful, which is, again, probably why Before Sunset is my favorite of the three. Before Midnight is much more about what is, and I would say that it is by far the most grounded of the three movies, because Before Sunrise almost in many ways feels like a dream. It's just like the possibility of this heady romantic connection, it taking place over the span of a single night, and you almost have, it's almost a fantasy film in many ways, even though, there's no magic or swords or sorcery involved. And then Before Sunset is, a little bit more grounded, but it's also just so sweepingly romantic that it just lifts you up off the ground and takes your heart soaring above the clouds. And Before Midnight has those moments, but it deals much more with, the realities of a committed, ongoing relationship. And not to skip all the way to the end, but it really comes down to the line in the last scene of the movie where Jesse says, if you want true love, then this is it. This is real life. It's not perfect, but it's real. And I find that to be an incredibly powerful ending note for the trilogy, because, Jesse and Céline had those moments of brief connection in Before Sunrise and Before Sunset. But then at the end of Before Sunset, we learned they chose to commit to one another. They chose to live their lives together. And that brings with it its own set of challenges. This is kind of the movie after the happily ever after in many ways, which is something that, it means that this movie was always going to be, it always was going to have to reckon with different challenges, because the idea in the first movie was, will Jesse and Céline, be able to hold on to this connection? And then the second movie was, now that they've had this chance to reconnect, will they take that chance? And then they did. The third movie was either going to have to completely tear them apart and then bring them back together, or it was just going to have to do something much more difficult, but ultimately much more rewarding, which is to show two people who love each other very, very deeply, but are ultimately, experiencing all the challenges in life that love cannot always directly solve. And so ultimately, I think what it really comes down to is something that you said in your opening remarks, which is, this is the movie that it had to be, based on what, where Jesse and Céline find themselves. But there are still moments of absolute true beauty in amidst some of the some real ugliness at a lot of points. But in its own way, the ugliness is also beautiful because it feels so real and so authentic. And when we'll talk about the fight scene that is really the cornerstone of the movie. I knew about that going in. I knew that there's going to be a fight scene. And that increased the tension, because ultimately I love these characters so much that my only thought was, please let them come out of this okay. Please let them, not break up. Please let them stay together. Please let this love endure. And so my heart was in my throat watching this movie for the first time. I've rarely been more anxious or more upset or more scared watching a movie, even though it's just about a romantic connection, not like a horror film. It feels like a horror film in certain ways.
Well, no, I was going to say, you actually remind me of, it reminds me of when I actually properly watched Alien for the first time, of sort of, being so scared waiting for the chest burster scene to happen, and then pausing the movie when they're all sitting around the table, standing up and pacing around before I'm sitting back down, and hesitantly pressing play. And so it's funny that, that's kind of what you're describing for this, which completely different circumstances. But I get it because, and I knew that there was at least going to be some tension and potentially I was ready for the end of their marriage, potentially. I think I had watched the trailer for the film, and so I had an idea of it. And I will say I was like holding my breath in when it gets to the point in the movie where she says, you know, I don't love you anymore. It's like, oh God, is that how it ends? And, and thankfully it didn't. Is that in other movies that can be a moment of pure truth. I think in this film, it's something said out of anger, and, and by the end of the movie, we say, okay, well, that's not actually, uh, that may be what she's feeling in the moment, but that's not really, it's not actually the end of their relationship. So, um, I think I've always been scarred from there. There's a moment in the film Closer, um, where Natalie Portman's character just, turns her head over on the pillow and says, "I don't love you anymore." And Jude Law says, "Since when?" She says, "Just now, right now." And it's the truth. And so I whenever I hear that in a movie, I'm like, oh God. But yeah, thankfully not the case, with this film. But it's just the fight scene was so riveting to watch because even though there was fear on my part that they were going to, and that their marriage was going to end, and the heartache that would ensue from that. Just the fact that we've seen these characters through the other two films sort of go through so many different emotions, and sort of they've had like conflict in their discussions, but never like full blown arguments. Like there's a scene in the first film where they're like, we just have our first fight, but it's not really, This is the film where they're actually fighting, and so even though it's difficult to watch, also from a sort of, you know, character and actor perspective, like I said, it's riveting to watch. These two just like go ahead and say all the things that they've had bottled up, and even though like I'm not probably the best person to speak to about relationships, and from that perspective, but or at least not romantic relationships, but in terms of like any kind of personal relationship, even relationships you have with close friends or your parents especially, there's times when you have to say things that you need to get off your chest that you both mean and you don't mean, and it's cathartic, but it's painful, and it's things that you wish you could immediately take back, but at the same time, like, sometimes they just need to, escape from inside of you and go somewhere. And that's what we get in this film with these two. And so even as I'm watching, they're like, like, oh no, like it was very like, um, just enthralling to watch, just from a, especially as I said, from a performance standpoint. It's so great. And but Yeah, no, just such a relief though that at least it ends in a good place, like I said before, because I'd have a whole different read on it if that was not the case.
Yeah. Yeah, no, ultimately, this movie is, I find it to be a tremendously hopeful movie. It is not in any way a cynical movie. You know,
Yeah.
it could have been if it had ended on that note of, you know, these relationships, you know, they just aren't meant to last. And the movie does reckon with that idea, but ultimately it makes it very clear on which side it comes down. And we'll talk about in detail, like, the moments where it like really emphasizes its true, you know, perspective. But you know, the fight scene is, you know, and we don't need to skip right to that, but because it, you know, we really kind of builds up to it, but it is the centerpiece of the movie. It is a 40-minute sequence. You know, that's something I don't think we've ever seen in a movie before, is like a 40-minute argument, really, unless you want to count something like 12 Angry Men, which is basically, you know, the entire movie is something like that. But this is different.
But with that's a situation that's so heightened because it's not something that we encounter in everyday life. They're deciding a man's fate in a court of law, which is not like, it's certainly something that, you know, we have a chance of being a part of, but it's still not a part of everyday life. An argument between a married couple is something that's much more grounded and down to earth and something that's relatable. And so we almost, like, part of the reason why we don't usually see stuff like this is because we don't want to, because we go to the movies for escapism, and sitting in an argument between two spouses is like, that's what we went to the movies to get away from. and so yeah, it's a credit to the film that, like, it's so, like, enthralling to watch, and it's so beautifully scripted that, you know, that and plus we've been through so much with these two, so, you know, so we're just glued to it.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why it's such an incredibly compelling scene, is because it not only is like 40 minutes of, you know, emotional, tense, high stakes, but it fluctuates. You know, it's much more. It's one of the most realistic arguments I've ever seen on screen.
I want to say real quick that I was so mesmerized by, like, the fact that it wasn't just like a 40-minute streaming match, or even like stayed in the same place emotionally with these characters. There were moments where they dipped out of anger and back into tenderness between the two of them, but then one of them would say one little thing that would set them off again, and I found that so interesting and so brilliant.
No, it really is the kind of argument you can only have with someone you love and someone you know intimately, because only in that situation would do you have the knowledge of the other person, and in such a deep way that you can, you know, understand these things that they're saying, but there's like raw feeling behind it. And if you say just even slightly the wrong thing, you can open up another box of, you know, separate issues, which is what happens here. But also the moments where they settle back down, and you do see real intimacy and connection, and that's where, you know, that like these two people are still very much in love. And it is something that, it's one of the things that I find the best crafted in the entire movie, even though it's very difficult to watch because it feels so real. But ultimately, where it comes down is that these two people, you know, have lived a life, you know, in the time since we saw them last, you know. Between the first movie, Before Sunrise and Before Sunset, you know, Jesse and Céline, they didn't interact at all. You know, they just were holding on to the memory of this perfect, you know, interaction that they've had, and they lived their own lives in that time. You know, Jesse got married unhappily. He has a kid, a son who we actually get to meet in this movie, Hank, who he loves dearly, and is one of his reasons for being. Céline, you know, got a career that she has embarked on, had a series of not very fulfilling relationships, And ultimately, when they come back together, there's an electric charge because these two people, as we talked about last week, very much are soulmates. And at the end of the second movie, when we talk, when Jesse misses the plane, baby, are you going to miss that plane? I know, which we gushed about how much we loved that ending and its kind of beautiful ambiguity. But it was an ambiguous ending that wasn't that ambiguous because we had a sense that, yes, indeed, Jesse was not going to get on that plane, and indeed, this was going to be the start of something. And so it was. Jesse and Céline have now been together for 9 years since we last saw them. They have lived together. They have 2 children together, 2 twin girls. They, have a relationship with Jesse's son from his previous marriage, and who Céline actually seems to be very close with. But shit happened in that interim. Namely, the end of Jesse's marriage, which, as you could probably guess, did not go very well when he told his wife that, I actually met my soulmate and she's this, this beautiful French woman who I met once 9 years ago, and she's the love of my life, and I'm going to go be with her. And his ex-wife, perhaps understandably, did not take that very well, clearly. Clearly, she did not handle it the best because we get,
I know, it was kind of like darkly humorous, like, why does she still hate me so much? It's like, well, I mean, it probably didn't go over well.
No, and to be fair to her, Jesse's ex-wife, we don't really get her perspective. We do get a sense, because she's not a character in this movie. Their son Hank is, and it does seem that, while Jesse and Celine's opinion of Jesse's ex-wife is harsh, some of it might be fair, because it does seem like she became quite vindictive in her, and like the scene where where Céline finally lets her anger out and talks about the fact that when she moved back to Paris to give birth to her children, and because it was a difficult pregnancy and she needed to be with her mother, and Jesse's ex-wife specifically used that time when Jesse, moved over to be with her to legally move their son away so that she could have full custody and essentially screw Jesse out of, having a potentially stronger relationship with her son. You get the sense that that is an open beating wound that has never healed in their relationship. And clearly for Jesse and, they talk about the fact that perhaps Hank's mother, Jesse's ex-wife, has been, she's descended into alcohol. She might be manipulative, psychologically abusive. Again, we don't know if that's fair, but it does seem like they.
I do want to take a moment there just to say, to reiterate, we don't get her point of view in this, and if and it's something that I've had the chance to go through personally with when my mom and dad separated back in 2008. Was that there's no objective truth in a breakup, in the dissolution of a marriage, which I will say made it sort of darkly humorous when they got back together, like how gleefully happy the two of them were, because I got front row seats to how furious they were with each other, and the fact that there's 2 separate realities in that situation. I will say, without getting the actual perspective of of Jesse's ex-wife, it is a little unfair, but that's not the story we're getting. The story we're getting is from their point of view, and so we kind of have to infer from that. And I would say I think we get a little bit closer to a more objective viewpoint from Jesse's son.
Yes.
Because he's the one who's actually caught in the middle of it. And he's actually he seems very emotionally astute about how to navigate this, because he's like, maybe don't show up then because things are going to be worse for mom, and then yeah, and then it's going to be harder for me, and and so yeah, so yeah, but it's just a fact of a situation like that there's enough pain to go around, and and so like, none of this is to say that they're not justified in their anger, especially if uh you know just because Jesse's in the situation of where he barely gets to see his son, and he does have the right to be upset about that, and and it just adds a level of tragedy to the whole film, and yeah, it's just like those opening scenes, like, are like tough to watch, because you can just sort of see his internal pain, like Ethan Hawke's performance in this movie. Like, obviously, both he and Julie Delpy are just fantastic. But especially in those opening scenes, just watching him kind of bury all this. And try to bury all this deep down, and you can tell it's like a powder keg ready to explode.
Yeah, or to use Céline's terms, this is the day that you that you light the ticking time bomb that will destroy our lives. I'm marking this, and then Jesse's like, first of all, you don't light a time bomb, you set it. He has a tendency to get very pedantic in his words when he is when he's angry about this stuff.
Oh my god! Like, it is like the most hilarious thing when he's face down on the couch and he says, "The toaster, not enough." It's like, not now, man, not now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, and it makes sense. He is a writer, but it is darkly hilarious. But in particular, like, we're talking so much about Jesse's ex-wife, even though she's not a character in this movie, because really the relationship that they had that got destroyed, by Jesse's choice to be, to instead be with Céline, is, what drives most of the conflict of this movie, because it ultimately, it's not necessarily a tragedy that their marriage ended, as Céline says later in the movie. Like, if it wasn't me, your marriage would have ended over something else. Jesse and Céline were unhappy. Jesse and his ex-wife were unhappy even before Céline came back into their lives. They were probably two people who never should have gotten married in the first place. And the one good thing that seems to have come out of their relationship was their son, who, Jesse loves dearly. But there's also an inherent tragedy in the sense that before sunset, Jesse tells Céline one of the reasons he was staying with his ex-wife was that, I look at my little boy and I think I would suffer any torture to be with him all the days of his life. And then we see in this movie, when he made the choice to be with Céline, he gave that up. The one thing that he said he didn't want to do, he did it because he recognized that this connection with Céline was something that he had to pursue. And, he gained more out of it in addition to getting to be with the love of his life. He also, he gained two new beautiful twin daughters, who he clearly loves just as much. But the thing about his son is that, his son is, like, ultimately not getting to be in his life quite as much. And that's something that is just grating on Jesse's soul. It's an open, aching wound that he can't heal because, frankly, I do think he and his son still have a good relationship. They seem to have a good connection, but it's not the same if you can't be with them every day of their life. And, and Jesse talks about the fact that, like, this is a critical time. He's going into high school. He needs his father. And he's trying to feel his way through that. But it becomes kind of a demarcating red line for the fact that the only way he's going to be able to be in his son's life as to the extent that he wants is if they move back to the United States. And Céline doesn't want to do that because, she has her own life here in Paris, and she also has a new job opportunity. And she also recognizes that Jesse's ex-wife is not going to give them full custody. They're going to, they still would be like only seeing him every other weekend. So she's trying to be, much more rational and pragmatic about it, but it ends up coming out as kind of a raw, wound. And it's not that Céline is unfeeling, because she seems to have a great relationship with Jesse's son. In fact, he actually seems in some ways to be closer to her than he is to his father. He calls her multiple times, and she loves him clearly. But
which is, it's very evident that that's a sore point. It's one of the, it's, you can just see like the internal fury when, his son's, chats away with her on the phone, and then, and then the phone doesn't get handed to him. It's, which is just one of those things. Like, rationally, you should be very happy that your son has a really good relationship with your wife, who is not his, mother. But because he's going through all this turmoil of feeling like he's not there, there's a bitterness that's there that, it is, easy to understand. But also, like, they need to practice some more open communication about that.
Yeah, and it's clearly in one of Jesse's frustrations is that he is making a tremendous effort to try and connect with his son. It's notable that the movie opens up with him dropping his son off at the airport, and Jesse is just much in the way he kept trying to extend his relationship with Céline, at the end of last movie, by taking every moment. He keeps trying to have this one last moment of connection with his son. And, they've had a great time the past 6 weeks on vacation. Hank tells him it was the best summer of his life, although part of that was, again, probably the fact that he shared a kiss with that little Melina girl as something about which he told Céline and not Jesse. But it's, and his son, I don't think it's malicious. I don't see resentment from his son, from Hank, towards Jesse. It just seems like he's kind of at that disaffected teenage era where it's like, my dad's trying to have that emotional connection with me, but you're like, yeah. But it's tremendously frustrating for Jesse. And it's notable that, perhaps, Hank doesn't have the greatest home life, because when Jesse asked him about his mother, she's like, he brings up quite casually, I think she hates Daniel more than she hates you. So we know that his ex-wife is now also probably gotten into a new relationship, and she's still not happy. It's not a great place for Hank to be. So he might be a little disconnected. It might be one reason why he's bonded more with Céline. But Jesse is making every effort. He writes these beautiful letters. It's just it's not quite the same. And that it starts Jesse off in a bad place in this movie. He is essentially looking for, as Céline tells him, you always get like this when you drop him off. So this has happened before, but it's never been quite this pronounced, because, as Jesse says, this is a critical time. And Céline is also facing her own emotional crossroads with her decision whether or not she wants to take this new job. And so it really feels explosive in this moment. And that's why in the early scene in the car, when Céline has that quiet moment of like, oh my God, this is how it ends. I'm marking this moment. The threat of that feels very real, because the emotional stakes are so heightened, and understandable. The idea that Jesse would want to be there for his son, and Céline would want to maybe take this new job and not move and uproot back to the United States. So it's not like these two people are having conflict over some, stupid petty bullshit, even though that all, sometimes that can be a trigger. There are real issues here. And it's a testament to the strength of their love and connection that we do see at many times throughout this movie, that they are ultimately able to survive that.
Yeah. I will say just another thought on on Jesse and his son. Like, it's just, it's unfortunate for Jesse that his son is just at that age where it's like, I love you, Dad, but also like you're the last thing on my mind right now. And so you could tell watching that moment when his son's boarding the plane and Jesse is waiting for that turnaround and that wave goodbye, and his son is just so focused on, this is what I'm doing, I'm getting on the plane and doing all. It's like, don't take that personally. That's just that's just where the kid's head is at. It's doesn't have anything to do with you. And as a matter of fact, I would say that considering the circumstances, I think he and his son actually have a remarkably good relationship.
Yeah.
Because considering how little they get to see one another, it does seem like they're close and that his son really does love his dad. So yeah, it's not something that like can make the little amount of time he sees him, less painful. But I'm just saying we've seen those movies and TV shows and everything where those relationships are so much worse, and so it would be nice if he could at least take solace from that. But he's not able to, just because his mind is focused on what he's missing, and and that's not unfair of him to be dwelling on that. But yeah, no, and I did enjoy. I will say though, I did really enjoy them kind of like, okay, granted, when it's established in that first scene that he lives in Europe. Okay, what happened over the course of the two movies, but it is nice that they kind of save the reveal for when he steps outside and you see Céline there and the big car, and then you see their two daughters sleeping. Oh, and by the way, those girls are some of the deepest sleepers I've ever seen.
Yeah.
I was laughing about that. Oh, movies.
Yeah. No, I mean, and Jess and Ethan Hawke and Julie Delpy actually. I mean, it's a function of the plot. I mean, like Ethan Hawke and Julie Delpy talked about when they were writing this movie with Richard Linklater, like, you have to build scenes around like, when would Jesse and Céline actually have opportunities to have the type of conversations that they had in the first two movies when they have the kids running around. And then they're like, well, one of the things is when the kids are asleep in the car. And so, so we get that like awesome 13-minute scene where they're driving. It's not quite a one take, because I do think they have a cutaway in the middle to the ancient ruins that perhaps the young girls will never get to see, because you snooze, you lose, as Jesse says.
No, you know what? Until we're told categorically in some anecdote about Jesse's next novel in the fourth film that may or may not happen, I'm going to pretend like they did stop there on the way to the airport, because because if I was those girls, I would feel seriously robbed.
Yeah, no, I think that they do, because the other thing, like, I mean, it's there to kind of make a joke about the fact that like clearly Jesse and Céline are like, what's so great about these old ruins? They don't really want to go, but of course the kids do, and so but then,
which is so hilarious to me, because what little kid is like super psyched to go see some old ruins?
I mean, I think they probably want to go like climbing and exploring and that kind of stuff in there, but I'm sure that Jesse and Céline would be pretty bored. But it's funny because that is one of those moments where we still see Jesse and Céline's like connection and how it's evolved, like the fact that they they're having this conversation, and then And then they're like, so long, ancient ruins. What's so great about you anyway? And Celine's like, seen them one, seen them all. And then she's like, oh my God, we are shitty parents. Turn around, go back. And Jesse's like, no, we're like, again, it feels very, very real, like the kind of conversation that they would have. And I also absolutely love the fact that Jesse steals his daughter's apple.
I was just about to say that. Like, comedy gold right there. Just the fact that he steals it, thinks, oh, it's no big deal. And then the first thing that the girl asks when she wakes up is, what happened to my apple?
Yeah. It's beautiful. I mean, like the girls, Ella and Nina, they're not like huge characters in the movie, but they are pivotal because they're Jesse and Celine's daughters, and they, one of the central, two most important people in their world. But they do have a couple of great moments like that where, and we get a sense of when Celine is like filming them, and she's basically like, when you're anorexic, become anorexic or bulimic later, don't blame it all on your mother. And Jesse's like, Ella, this is a family apple. I love you. And I'm like, this feels like something that, like we've all seen this where, the parent will like steal something from the kid just because, even though they're not supposed to. And it makes it feel very authentic and real. And we get to see like and also I love it, like the kind of the beat that ends that scene where Celine looks back at the girls. It's like, you girls will remember this vacation very differently than we will. And Jesse's like, I see that in my mother. She remembers my childhood very differently than I do. Please stop filming me. and Celine's like, God, I love your mom. And he's like, that's because you missed the fucked up years. You're just getting the good hair. And again, like, Jesse's mom isn't a character in this movie, but we get an immediate sense of that relationship, that Jesse perhaps did not have the best relationship with his own mother at times. But now that, he's out on his own and they have grandkids, his mom's just all like sweet and loving. And Celine's like, oh, she's so great. And Jesse's like, It's one of those things that makes this movie feel, authentic and real, with all these, that we get such a full picture of their entire extended family, even if we don't get to see them, but it also becomes, as we said, a source of, conflict, because ultimately the fact is that Jesse and Céline, they are kind of, they live, as Jesse reminds Céline later, they live in Paris, France. He very much has chosen to orbit his entire life around her. And that's why the separation from his son becomes such a, sticking point, because it's the one thing that, like, he feels like he really sacrificed to be with Céline. But he also knows what he has. Like, when Céline challenges him, like, I think you need to move back to the US and be with your son. He's like, are you kidding me? Lose you and the girls? No, I'm not going to do that. That's the craziest thing I've ever heard. So, as he says, he's just trying to feel his way through it. But that can be a very painful process.
That is like, I will say that's one point during their argument where I'm like, she's venting a lot of frustration, but she's not really thinking that one through, because if he's that, guilt-ridden about what he's missing out with his son, there's no way on God's green earth he would ever leave, both her and their two girls, like, that's like, that would be a big non-starter for him. He would never want to do that. So, but I will say that when you're having an argument, thinking, the parts of your arguments through is not like, that is not exactly a big highlight of arguments. I can speak from personal experience. But yeah, no, but I really do love that, that opening scene in the car, just because, it's, I knew some difficult scenes were coming. So it was just, even though we do get a touch of it where because the subject of, potentially moving to the US is kind of touched on a little bit in that scene, and that's where, uh, things start. But we're not really into the weeds of it yet. So I feel like most of that car scene is just a fun look at where their family life is at.
Yeah.
And it just does such a great job because it, like, we're putting in the middle of this very specific scene, but it fills in so many gaps of, of their family dynamic, and what they've been doing, for the past 9 years. And it's just almost, in a weird way, it reminds me of the way that the plot is covered in Mad Max Fury Road, which is, uh, exposition delivered via action and forward motion. Obviously, this is not a car chase scene. But it kind of serves the same function of, we're in a moment of their life, but we're catching a lot of things, through through context.
Yeah.
And it's just so wonderfully well done.
Yeah, no, this is a textbook case of exposition done right, because they tell the audience everything that they need to know within the course of a natural flowing conversation that feels authentic and is entertaining. It doesn't feel like the movie's stopping to tell us all this. And they do that, and also in part by mixing in the little moments of humor and and joy, and like when Céline is teasing Jesse about being Captain Cleanup, who's been missing in action all these years, but there's also moments of true beauty in there, where, like, when they're talking about the fact that like the son, Hank had his first kiss with Melina, the little Greek girl who he had met on vacation, and Jesse's like, "Hey, what if they spend their entire lives together?" And Celine kind of makes fun of him in a joking way. She's like, "You're so corny. What are you, a 12-year-old girl?" But, like, we've seen how romantic they both are, and it leads to the moment.
I find that hilarious, considering how they ended up together.
Oh, yeah, no, it's intentionally ironic, because they were very much swept in, and that's what Jesse's trying to hint, like, hey, what if they spent their entire lives together like we did? But Céline, over the years, and this is a trend that we see throughout the movie, Céline started as very, very romantic, and she still is, but she's also become much more realistic and grounded, and Jesse in many ways has become the more romantic of the two. And we skip that in that scene where
but also maybe, like, she's presenting that way, but
Yeah.
we also see, and this comes out at the end of the film, that no, actually, maybe she is looking for the fairy tale
I think so.
story. And that's sort of part of what's at the root of her anger, and which is understandable. We all say we look at things a certain way, or it's basically exactly sort of what the front that Jesse was putting up in the very first film, which was that he was a cynic, but actually, no, deep down he was the romantic. And so it's almost it's almost like they switched positions there, and she's putting up the front as you know as the more cynical, realistic person. But part of her pain is that she does want,
Mm-hmm.
uh, want that sort of perfect romance. And but yeah, no. Oh, but I was just about to say something, and then we got off track, and I forgot what I was thinking about. shoot, I've gone and forgotten. Let's go back to, go ahead. It'll pop back in my head.
Well, but yeah, so I mean, I think you're absolutely right about the fact that both Jesse and Céline are still very romantic, and it's just that it's become enmeshed with, the more complicated feelings of real life, but they both still have those instincts and they can have that connection. But in particular, in the scene in the car, the one thing I really want to highlight is when they're talking about the possibility of Hank and Melina spending their entire life together. And Céline has the line like, "Do you remember your first love?" And Jesse says, "Yes, I do. It was you." And this is Jesse, who has, been married before. And he's telling her that, no, you were actually the first person I fell in love with. And he seems almost genuinely hurt when Céline, won't acknowledge whether or not he was her first love. And she's kind of gently chiding him for it. And then she's like, "Jesse, come on, how old are you?" And Jesse has the beautiful and heartbreaking and wonderful line where he just quietly says, "I'm 41 and I've loved only you." And, and that's where you really see his heart, the true heart of the character. For all his frustrations, with the situation with his son, this is why he's here. This is why he's with Céline. This is why he would never give this up, is because this was the woman he had the connection with. She is his soulmate, and he is hers too. She is just, she has her own kind of underlying conflict where, as we get into later, she's terrified about the possibility of, potentially having to sacrifice her own ambitions in the name of love, and, she's like, I'm not, it's basically an idea of she's like, this is bigger than me. I, as a feminist, I do not want to have to orbit my life around you and, your career. But she knows that this is still important to her. She's not she's doing everything she can to make this work. And even the fact that she is even if Jesse wasn't truly her first love in the same way she was his, that he is her true love, very much so. And we see that at the end, even after she tells him she doesn't love him anymore. She has that line in the end thing where she's like, "I'm an angry person. I hurt my kids, my work, and everyone I love." And that includes Jesse, and she's racked with guilt about that because, as you said, at a deep level, she is still the same 23-year-old who we met in the first movie, who had this very romantic vision of the world, just as Jesse is, that same person. They still have those set points. And we revisit them, throughout the movie. And that's why no matter how cynical sometimes they present themselves, they have not lost the true romantic heart of the characters.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Let's I'm going to go ahead and we're only a couple minutes away from the hour mark, so I'm going to go ahead and pause and let's do the mid-roll, and then we can switch gears and we can talk about the fact that there's a pretty big scene in this movie that has many different characters, which is a bit different for these movies. But let's do the mid-roll real quick. I will say, we took a week longer coming back because I got back from my vacation and I was like, yeah, I'm not ready to go back to streaming yet. So that's why we're back after 3 weeks instead of 2. But the timing actually may end up working in our favor because, as we were discussing before we went live, next week, I think we're going to cover the first 4 episodes of season 2 of The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, which, I do just want to take a moment and just say, I am so loving the first 3 episodes we've gotten, and we both kind of unabashedly love the show, regardless of all the bullshit that goes around, which I increasingly have less and less time for. But I was, as I was watching the first 3 episodes of the season, I was just like, I can't believe we get something like this, especially as someone who, going all the way back to like 2001, I think was when I first read the Silmarillion. I read it pretty quickly after I finished reading the original trilogy, um, and just to be covering some of that material, in this series is something that I never dreamt of, and so getting to, you know, there's a pretty big scene in these episodes between two characters, and there's a line, uh, delivered by someone who's not so trustworthy. Uh, you know, you will no longer be merely known as the scion of Feanor. You will be the Lord of the Rings. And the fact that a line in the series has scion of Feanor, it's just like I'm like, am I actually watching this? Is this real? Is this the material that we're actually getting? And I'm just so blown away and so happy to be getting this. And I actually, I'll save the real big gushing for next week. But I do feel like, despite all the contentious discussion around the series, I do think that this is going to go down as one of the most important Tolkien adaptations ever made. Because it's doing something that no other adaptation has been able to do. And I don't know what the future of like the rights will be, but I have a feeling that this may be the closest we get to like Silmarillion, like proper Silmarillion material in terms of like first age stuff. Like I don't I don't think Warner Brothers and Peter Jackson will ever get those right. So, and I have lots of complicated feelings about that we may discuss next week. Just about, I actually think it's a healthy thing that this series has been under a different creative division, and the fact that it gets to be its own thing is nice. I just think it's so enthralling to see where this series has gone, and the fact that it looks like next week is when we're going to finally get to see Tom Bombadil on the screen, and I'm like, really? And yeah, so this is just a roundabout way of saying that I'm really excited to get into talking about the season next week, and just it's been amazing, and it's reaffirmed to me how much Tolkien's creation means to me, because I've been like, it just stirs something in me that a lot of other stuff does, and what I'm saying now is not about like competition and or any of that stuff, but like, I am loving House of the Dragon. I think that season 2 is actually one of the strongest seasons of anything sort of Westeros related that we've ever gotten. But I think I've come back around to that place in my life where Tolkien is what's speaking to me, and the hope of these Middle-earth stories. And and that's why I've loved it for, over 20 years. And it's just so rewarding to get to watch this series. The only thing, like, I'm bummed up. I love the fact that we got 3 episodes off the bat, but the fact that means there's only 5 episodes left bums me out. But
yeah. No, I am so I love the show. I just it like makes my heart just feel so warm and, you know, grateful that we get to see things like this. There were, when we talked about the first season, you know, I relayed the moment like when the series opens in Valinor with the speech that Galadriel's brother gives to her about the ship and and the, you know, learning to touch the darkness. And it was one of those moments that I will always remember watching TV where I'm just like, I can't believe I'm watching this on my screen right now. And I had like 3 of those moments in these first 3 episodes. I was just so delighted
I was so upset that I didn't have the chance, and it was predominantly because of my work schedule. I would not have been able to get away because there were screenings, but I did not get to go on a little mini road trip and go to a theater to see these episodes on the big screen like I did for the 2-episode premiere of season 1. I will say that getting to sit in a darkened theater as, you know, Morfydd Clark's, you know, voiceover begins in that first episode, and seeing the screen open up on Valinor and all that, getting to witness that in a darkened theater on a big giant, because it was a big screen and the sound was killer. I like, it's just going to be one of my top experiences. And the fact that I threw caution to the wind and I drove like 2 hours, you know, at least 2 hours. It might have even been a little more just to go see that. Like, I don't have one single regret about that. That's like, I will say, like, you know, talking about the passage of time, that's one of the great things about being an adult versus when I was a kid. Like, you know, it's such a liberating feeling when you're all grown up and you can do ridiculous things that make you happy. Without having to worry about anybody judging you. Well, maybe a little bit, but so I am kind of bummed that I didn't get to do that again this year, because these episodes, especially episode 2, would have been amazing to see on the big screen. But I was just as enthralled sitting there and watching them on my TV screen. And I did actually break the episodes down where I watched 1 episode a night because I really wanted to savor it. And yeah, so next week we're just going to, you know, go on and on about these episodes, and the 4th episode, which, you know, I can't wait for. It's going to be great, and yeah, oh my God, we'll be talking about everything, but also Mr. Bear McCreary, who is just doing amazing things once again. Yeah.
I've been listening to the soundtrack. In particular, I have listened to Bear McCreary and Rufus Wainwright's rendition of Old Tom Bombadil an embarrassing number of times since I downloaded the soundtrack. I love it so much.
I've only listened to the first half because I don't want to listen to any music from the climax of the season, because I do want to save like my musical experience of that for the actual show. But I will say, like, I had one tiny little disappointment when I listened to that initial track, but then I listened to the River Daughter track, you know, and in that track there is the, you know, very small, you know, I don't know if it's exactly that, but it's one of the "Hey doll, Mary doll" type of lines, and I was like, "Good, they fit it in somewhere," because I know it's kind of ridiculous, but but I want it in there somewhere, and so that made me very happy. But yeah, I actually didn't know how I was going to feel about the whole you know, Tom Bombadil thing in the show, but now that, you know, he's coming next week, like, I'm so pumped for it, and hearing that music was just like, Yeah. I never thought that we'd get him, and I was not against the decision for him to be cut out of the films, because I actually thought that that was the right decision, because those, are telling, a very, they've got a lot of story, and that is kind of a moment in the books where things just kind of stop. But I am very much looking forward to seeing him in this series.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that this is frankly a perfect place for it because, of the nature of his character. And I'm very keen to see how he's going to be played by Rory Kinnear, and who's a great actor. And I remember reading the article that he was going to be in the season, and and part of me wishes I could have just learned that by watching the show, but on the other hand, it's been so cool to know that that's coming, because I also agree. Like, I think that Peter Jackson made the right decision to not include Tom Bombadil in the movies, but for pacing reasons and thematic reasons. But I think that if they can do it in this show, even if it's not what was originally from the text, I'm all for it. And they part of we haven't gotten to this part in the season as well, but they're also bringing in things like the Barrow Whites, which were not going to be included in the movies, and they're going to work them in here. But ultimately, it's just been so rewarding to see so many things that I never imagined I would see on screen in this show, and also things that I had never anticipated, that we would get to see, and just because they're original creations, which I know is a point of controversy for some. I'm all for it. I really want to see.
I'm fully on board with it, because the show has established itself now, and it's, for me, it's now part of the tapestry of storytelling surrounding Tolkien's works. And it just goes back to the idea that Tolkien himself had, that there would be other works made by other hands, and just to get this age of Middle Earth expanded upon by all the people involved in this series. It's just so rewarding. And before we just wrap up, we'll call this our little tease for next week, even though it's a bit more than that. I think you and I are just a bit too eager to launch into discussing it. But I do want to say, and the whole cast is just phenomenal, but the part that has me really excited this season, and that's been confirmed so far, I'm so excited to see what Charles Edwards is bringing, to the role of Celebrimbor. I did not anticipate that he would be such a central focus of this season, but I'm so excited by it, and obviously he's, very important to the story. But I like that so much emphasis is being put this season on the relationship between him and Sauron, and, and the tragedy of his character, and what a magnificent actor to play that character. I feel like he's one of those British actors that gets to play a lot of supporting roles, and he's never really gotten, this kind of a meaty part in this big of a project. And so I'm based on things that I've seen in the previews for further episodes. I'm so excited to see what he brings to it. Yeah.
I'm so happy that he's getting to shine, and that Charlie Vickers is getting to play this iteration of Sauron. So yeah, we'll have plenty to talk about this week, and at the risk of just extending this just a little bit longer, all I'll say is the knockout of the new additions to the cast for me. Speaking of revered British actors who are getting to play, Ben Daniels as Círdan so good. I loved his performance so much in this.
And also, I completely forgot he was going to be in the show. Freaking Kieran Hines is coming in as like a dark wizard or something to that effect. We're not quite sure, but I was like, that's weird. That looks like Kieran Hines. Oh my God, it's Kieran Hines. Yeah, no. Yeah, and you're right. Ben Daniels, I was like, and again, these are actors who I had heard earlier on that they were going to be in the show, but then you kind of forget about some of those announcements, and I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe we're getting this caliber of actors, coming into this series, and to be clear, like this show has already established itself as having an absolutely extraordinary cast. But yeah, having someone like Ben Daniels, playing Kieran, it's like, oh my God, really? Yeah. So anyway, we're gonna get into all of that. Then that's more than a little taste that we just offered. But like, to be fair, we just watched those first 3 episodes, so like there was no way that we couldn't dive into that a little bit. But yeah, so so we'll be discussing that next week, and then I do believe what we'll have planned for the week after that will be Black Swan. Tentatively, I think that's what we're doing. I do want to reach out and see if we can get 1 or 2 people on to talk about that one with us, and maybe even next week for Rings of Power. It might be time for me to message a couple of our friends and see what they're doing next week. But yeah, so and then after Black Swan, we've also talked about Anna Karenina. It is time to get back to a Knights of Kira stream. So yeah. Okay. So anything else before we dive back into the movie?
Nope. Just thank you all for having stuck with us even through our hiatus. And because we don't often always do this, I did notice that you're creeping up towards close to 400 subscribers. I think you're at 398. So if anybody is watching and wants to stick around for the channel for the discussions that we're having, consider giving that subscribe button a push so you don't miss.
I will say that I do just feel further enabled to keep doing like 4-hour streams, because I'm like, hey, our subscribers are going up, so why not? But no, one other thing I want to mention, and this could be something that you and I just talked about off screen, but hey, why not? We're in the mid-roll. I do want to say I've been on a roll with watching some new shows that that I've been excited about. I am currently in the middle of watching oh God, what's the Blue Eye Samurai, which is something that we talked about previously as a show that I wanted to get into, and I've got 2 more episodes left of that, and from what I understand, there will be further seasons. So one of the best like animated series that I've ever watched, and it is very steeped in not only the films of Akira Kurosawa, but just totally and it's funny to say this because these films also took from Kurosawa, but there's a clear inspiration from Kill Bill as well. so like it's just right up my alley. It's so good. And switching gears to a different kind of show, I've also been watching the NBC series The Good Place.
Mm-hmm.
Which another one of those shows that I've wanted to watch for years, never seem to find the time, which is hilarious because I'm binging through it like crazy. It's been like 5 days and I'm already almost at the end of season 2. So, that's not going to take me very long.
No.
And I'm looking forward to also tackling the new Netflix series Terminator Zero which looks great. And so yeah, I've been quite enjoying the new run of shows that I've been able to get into. So
yeah. And I finally started to watch Shogun again, so
nice.
We may have to catch up with that once I finish. It's slow going because they're dense, long episodes, so I'm taking my time with it. But loving the show so far.
Oh man, yeah. And once you finish it, let's talk. So because we might go ahead and do a stream on that because it's so good and it'll give me an excuse to watch it again. Okay, so let's dive back into the movie, like moving into the the setting of where they're at. They're on this extended vacation in Greece, and they're staying with other people, which means we get a really a couple of scenes actually with with new characters, like a nice number of new characters, and that sort of expands the conversation into new places. And no, I thought it worked great, and I thought the performers they got for these characters were really good. And and there's so much sort of there's is wonderful subtext for like what they end up talking about, and then the fact that it kind of gets at things that are kind of under the surface for Jesse and Céline. And it's I thought it was nice, especially where the big sort of scene around the table happens, which kind of breaks up the scenes that are just between Jesse and Céline, so it adds a new flavor to this film.
Yeah, this is one of the things that when I mentioned this movie is a little bit differently structured than the first two. One of the reasons is frankly just the simple fact it has more characters, like actual supporting characters. In the previous two movies, like basically anyone who wasn't Jesse and Céline was just kind of a one scene passing through kind of character, and some of those were great, but in this case, like Ariadne and Stephanos have their own like unique, fun dynamic. So the Achilles and Anna, Patrick, the one that they're staying with, the elder writer they're staying with, and in particular, when we get to the climax of the dinner scene, I'm going to gush about Natalia and the actress who plays her, who probably gives one of the best 2-minute scenes in the entire series. But in particular, these characters are ultimately there to serve Jesse and Céline's story, and they all kind of present unique reflections of their relationship and where they are at this point. Ariadne and Stephanos have clearly been married a long time, like Jesse and Céline. They have kids. They have their own unique dynamic that, well, not exactly Jesse and Céline's dynamic, like clearly is also born of love and intimate knowledge. And we get great scenes with them, like the scene like when they're fighting over the knife and Céline is like mortified but they're laughing, and Ariane's like, we're not fighting, we're negotiating. And Céline's like, negotiation. And then we get young Achilles and Anna coming into the picture, and they're kind of the younger versions of Jesse and Céline who had this chance romantic meeting, but they also seem more practical than Jesse and Céline were at that age. And just as a side note, I absolutely love the moment when Celine's talking about negotiation. She asked Anna what her system is, and Anna mimes the blowjob, and Céline seems aghast, and then she makes her own joke, and then Stephanos has the hammer line of, we used to have that system. I love that so much. But yeah, and then obviously Walter and Natalia are not a couple, but they're very like intimate and familiar with each other because Natalia was married to Patrick's old friend Elias, and they provide another perspective of like what could be, but also where Jesse and Céline are in their relationship. And it all comes together in that dinner scene, as you said. But even before that, we get great moments of interaction, like when Jesse is talking about his books to Patrick and Stephanos, or when Céline is, at the, chopping up the vegetables for dinner with Natalia and Ariadne, and like we get more revealing perspectives on Jesse and Céline separately, because really we've only ever seen them together, before this in the movie, and they've always been bouncing off each other. Here we get to see them bounce off other people, and so we learn more about them.
Yeah, no, it's so funny because it actually took me a minute to get that's like all the men were, writers, and and they were all the artists and stuff. And because in that first scene where Jesse is describing his book, I hadn't quite caught on to that yet, and so I was like, they're being very charitable towards him as he's going on about these sort of more outlandish story ideas. But then once I understood that, okay, the writers, okay, that all makes sense. And
I don't think Stephanos is a writer, but that makes him like a nice counterpoint to the fact that like Jesse and Patrick are talking about this like very pseudo-intellectual idea for a novel, and Stephanos just like, I think it's going to be too long. and Patrick's like, don't listen to him. He makes bicycles. But he kind of like calls Jesse on his bullshit a little bit when Jesse's like, it's like, this is a story about perception. He's like, kind of sounds like it's about time, which it is. And then he calls him out and is like, all right, so what's the connection between these people? Are they going to have sex? And Stephanos is kind of a one-track mind in that guy, but it's a good grounded relationship, because clearly these people are all familiar and intimate with one another in the sense that they've spent the last 6 weeks together. So again, it feels like we're learning things about the characters and where they are in the kind of naturalistic state, including the fact that like after Jesse and Céline got back together, he wrote another book about them coming back together called That Time, and it paid for their apartment. But Céline obviously seems to have a little bit more complicated feelings towards this one that comes out.
I do like that, that this scene when they're talking about the second book, and it's like in the book, what happened after the screen faded to black in the last movie is made plain. But is that embellished on the part of Jesse, or did that happen? Well, we're left to.
I alluded to that the last time we talked about. I kind of think it did, because Jesse has that kind of. Stephan's like, you did that, and Jesse's kind of like, yeah. And Stephan's like, you did that, huh? Yeah. So again, great little comedic interactions between the two, but also like emotionally revealing interactions. Like one thing that I've picked up on more on subsequent interactions of the fact, this movie is set in Greece, in the southern Peloponnese islands. And Céline kind of underscores that line when she's talking to Ariadne and Natalia, and she's like, this place is, it's soaked in like 1,000 years of myth and tragedy. And I was afraid something terrible was going to happen when we came here. And that's kind of the movie underlying the conflict that's going to come. But they also they make, like, Natalia turns it into a funny joke when she's like, you thought the Minotaur was going to eat your children, and Selena kind of laughs along with that. But it really is an essential part of this. Like, they picked this setting for a reason.
Well, and it does add a sense of foreboding. Like, it was the first time I'd seen that, and I noticed that line. I was like, oh God.
Yeah.
I was like, yeah, you're not in the clear yet. But yeah, no, it's, and I will say, like, I'm trying to I don't quite know all the characters' names. No, like, and the fact that the character of Anna, when it's sort of established in the scene in the car when Céline calls Jesse out on the fact that that he looks at women,
Mm-hmm.
and and then there's the fact that Anna comes through, in that scene, in her bathing suit, and like, and all the guys are like, looking at her. That's like,
Mm-hmm.
that's establishing like that there's some tension there, and it really comes out obviously in the hotel argument of there's a reason for that. Yeah, and and yeah, it's so the way that things like that sort of build the tension for things to come, later on, and um, yeah, so I thought that was really good, just like seeding little things along the way to build up the tension of waiting for the explosion of whatever's going to happen, and I thought that was really well done.
Yeah, no, every for these movies are very carefully written by Richard Linklater and Ethan Hawke and Julie Delpy, Oscar nominated for this screenplay again. And I had mentioned in previous streams the fact that like even though this movie seems very naturalistic in its dialogue, it's not improvised. They went over this screenplay many times and made many revisions and collaborated on the process of making sure that everyone was comfortable with what was ultimately ended up in the final product. Richard Linklater has basically said, if we all three of us don't like connect with a scene or an idea, it doesn't make it into the movie. But that means that absolutely everything that is in these early scenes, it's there for a reason. It's seeding, conflict, or potential. It's serving as setup for what will come later in the big climax in the fight scene. So that's the kind of thing that becomes infinitely more rewarding on a rewatch, is where you start to see like, oh, they were setting that up as early as like the 25-minute mark, and then it pays off at like minute 70, and it becomes, but it doesn't feel like setup. It doesn't feel like a big flashing sign, other than, as you said, like maybe the line about the Greek tragedy, 1,000 years of myth and like nothing else feels like a big flaring, like honking, foreshadowing. It just happens naturally, and then it's revisited equally naturally down the line.
Yeah, and no, I'm trying to think of other stuff that's brought up in the the dinner scene. It's because forgive me, since I've only seen the movie once. But
no, so I mean, like one thing is, for instance, as I alluded to earlier, the fact that like, clearly when they talk about how Jesse and Céline met, and the fact that he had written this book to try and find her, and then she had gone out to seek him and find him again, but clearly she is a little bit uncomfortable with the fact that he continued to like share those details of their lives by writing a second book and including that in like the stories about their intimate life, even though it's fictionalized and abstracted in that way. She clearly like gets very uncomfortable, for instance, when the hotel clerk asks her to sign the books as well. She's like, "You're the real Madeline, right?" And she's like, "No, not really." But then Jesse has her sign the books, and she's uncomfortable with that. And then in the argument, she's like, basically like, "You will never use anything about me or our children in one of your fucking books ever again." And Jesse kind of points out, like, "I'm a writer. I, take inspiration from my own life. That's not realistic," basically. But it's another source of tension and conflict for them.
Yeah, that was a moment where I was like, I understand why he urged her to sign the book, because like there's this tension. You don't want to let a fan down and all that. But I was like, dude, you better apologize for that as soon as you get into the room. And when he didn't, I was like, oh no. That's bad on you.
And then there's also like the underlying current about the fact that like Jesse and Céline have been gifted this this gift from Ariadne and Stephanos of a night at the hotel that will be away from their kids and their so that they can basically have a moment, a romantic moment to reconnect. And Céline keeps asking like, do we have to do this? Can we get out of this? And there's, she says it's because, she's so stressed about like wanting to pack up, for the kids and everything. But it's basically a kind of implied that it's also like, they don't know if they haven't had many intimate moments like this in recent times. So like, they don't have that, like they're essentially worried about like what that would be. Although they do fall back into their natural patterns on the walk to the hotel, but it kind of feels much more like the fact that this is something that perhaps they wouldn't ordinarily do is one of the reasons why this conflict kind of emerges. But it kind of speaks to where they are because, Jesse and Céline had their initial connections in these very romantic, spontaneous moments where they met by chance on the train and then spent an evening together, like on a whim. And then they reconnected, even though Céline had gone to seek Jesse out. It felt like a very spontaneous connection when they reconnected after 9 years, because what were the chances of that happening? This feels much more structured and perhaps more stifling, the fact that like they're being asked to have this intimacy together when they may not be feeling right up for it because there's all this simmering conflict going on, and they still love each other and they still like start out in that place, but it's a setting that is kind of artificial. And we get that in the scene where at first Celine's like, oh, this hotel room is so great, and by the end she's basically like, this hotel room gives me the creeps. But also just the fact that it's like less spontaneous is like, we see that reflected a little bit in like Anna and Achilles, because a lot of the conversation around the dinner table end up dealing very much with issues of romance and spontaneity, but like the other characters seem to have very different perspectives on it. Like Anna and Achilles seem like they're on great terms with each other, but then they're also just like, yeah, this will end. We'll break up eventually. And they seem fine with that. And Ariadne and Stephanos have like a very, intimate, loving connection clearly, but they also like, Stephanos is talking constantly about like sex taking place in the virtual world and like, all these things that are just driving Patrick up the wall, because clearly he's like, no. But it's like, but we see that like, even though Jesse,
I thought it was very like, it was very amusing to me, just the fact that then the conversation of like, computers writing books came up. I was like, oh, the timing on that is interesting. It's a lot of people would have words for Jesse and with his with the conclusion he draws about that. No, I was going to say, I just remember now earlier what I was thinking about when there's a discussion point that comes up about the fact that who are the younger two younger characters, Anna and Achilles, who they talked about talking on Skype and all that stuff, and I just couldn't help think about the fact that it points out like the difference in time, like the online communication is such a thing, and even when this film was made like 10 years ago, which is different from when Jesse and Céline had met, like how much of that would have saved them if there was that kind of technology around. And it just shows the difference a few years makes.
Yeah, and they like I think all this is very, deliberate, talking about different ways that relationships have evolved, and there's connection, like how connections in the digital age are going to be different. And it's intellectually interesting, but it's also like emotionally interesting because, again, we have the characters at different points in their lives. Patrick has separated from his wife because, as he said, we were never one person, always two. We preferred it that way. And then Anna and Archelaus are having a great time right now, but they also seemed less certain that it will be more, that this will last. And Ariadne and Stephanos are pretty established and easygoing, but they also are much more frank, when they're talking about the fact that it's they've broken up, other characters have broken up, and Ariadne is I think that's beautiful, that people are more practical about this kind of stuff. And it all was underscoring the fact that again, stripping away levels of romanticism, the idea that this is more realistic. This is the way relationships actually are. What Jesse and Céline had was kind of a little bit more fantastical, and isn't it more realistic that eventually the conflict will come in and break them up? But really, all of this exists to set up one of the most powerful scenes in the entire movie, which is when Natalia, the older woman played by the actress Xenia Kalogoropoulou, I butchered that name, which I feel bad about because she's wonderful, but it's notable that she really doesn't say much throughout the entire sequence. She had been talking with Patrick earlier. She makes an aside here and there. But meanwhile, as Anna and Archelaus and Ariadne and Stephanos and Patrick and even Jesse and Céline are making increasingly, one could say, cynical comments about relationships and where things stand. Jesse and Céline basically have a mini fight right there at the table where Céline brings their baggage into the open, that Jesse's going to try to make me move to Chicago and be a submissive housewife. And he's that's not what I said at all. I just said I miss my son. But it's it all feels like this is more conflict and practicality, and where's the romanticism? It's not realistic anymore. And then Natalia just has this beautiful 2-minute and 15-second speech where she just talks about her deceased husband, Elias, and just nothing more than just how much she misses him. And the fact that, what they shared their lives together, and she just, she thinks about the little details that they used to share, the way his arm would be draped over her and she would hold her breath because she she just felt so close and connected. But now, and how she thinks about what he would once say. But then now she's starting to forget him because he's, all the details of his face that had kind of withered away as he struggled with his illness. And now she's trying to force herself to remember him. And and then it all builds up to the idea where she talks about, and I'm just going to read all of this because I think it's so beautiful, where she says, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes I can actually see him. It's as if a cloud moves away and there he is. I could almost touch him. But then the real world rushes in and he vanishes again. For a while, I did this every morning when the sun was not too bright outside, because the sun somehow makes him vanish. And he appears and he disappears, like a sunrise or a sunset or anything so ephemeral. Just like our life, huh? We appear and we disappear, and we are so important to some, but we are just passing through. And in that 2-minute and 15-second scene, she shuts every single one of them up. They don't speak. They just listen to her. All their previous cynical, anti-romantic bullshit, frankly, gets completely washed away, because this is where the movie's heart truly lies. This is the movie's true perspective. The movie is not indulging in the idea that, romance is dead, and, any possibility of intimacy and connection in the future is lost. This is where the movie is still saying, yes, it's incredibly hard to have this kind of connection, but God damn it, is it worth fighting for? And don't lose that. Don't lose that connection. And I think that is, I find it just beautiful that she has this scene. It's really one of her only scenes in the movie. She just lays it out there, and at the end, Céline and Jesse are just kind of almost stunned into silence, and all they can do is just echo her words, to passing through. So again, credit to the actress, credit to the writing, which is notable. Julie Delpy wrote this scene, and she wrote it actually about, I believe she wrote it about her mother, who had passed away between the past two movies. So it's it's grounded in very real emotions, but they're using it to tell the story of the idea that, like, if you have a connection with somebody and it's beautiful, and it's it's the reason it's worth living for, and don't throw it away so lightly.
Well, it's very interesting to me that you say that Joy Delpy wrote this about her mother, because it's exactly what I thought of when I was watching this scene. My own mom, and sort of sometimes it's hard for me to, just conjure up, her face and in my mind's eye, especially her as she looked before she started getting really sick. And thankfully there's pictures. But sometimes it is tough. And so yeah, that scene really spoke to me. And yeah, I thought it was beautiful for exactly that reason.
No, I think it's in many ways the heart of the movie, which is a weird thing to say about, given the fact that it's Natalie is not a main character, but she provides that essential outside perspective because of where Jesse and Céline are emotionally. Like, they don't have that level of clarity, and Natalia has that clarity right now because she lived her entire life with her husband Elias, but then she lost him. And the pain of that wound has never left her and probably never will. And so she just shares her perspective in this scene, like in the hopes that it will, rekindle something in everyone at the table there, frankly. Like the idea that, like, hey, this is something that's possible. It is something that's worth fighting for. And as you mentioned, it doesn't necessarily even have to be like as a romantic connection. It's just like, if you have someone who's special and who you love, whatever their relationship is to you, like don't like let the little details or conflicts like cause you to dismiss that fake feeling and say it's not worth having. This is the reason we live. And I think that in particular, the language is also just beautiful. Yes, it's a little on the nose that she uses the words like a sunrise or a sunset or anything so ephemeral, but like that is really what these movies have been about. These moments in time that could have, been just singular and washed away, but which endured because of the love that the two characters had for each other. So,
yeah. In a similar vein, it's not so much about recalling images of the person's face, but I know in the case of my mom, after she passed away, I went through my phone and scoured my voicemail messages and thankfully your phone actually, after you delete voicemails, it actually keeps them in a deleted section, which is funny because the fact that you have to, it's like the trash can on your computer, like you have to delete them twice. But I never did that, so I went through and I got a good, like, I want to say probably somewhere between 12 to 14 voicemails left by my mom. And even though it hurts every time I play them, every so often I'll just sit and listen to them. They're not all especially long, except there's one that's hilarious because she stays on the line for a ridiculously long amount of time. you know, with long pauses between when Singapore pick up, but it's great because it refreshes her voice in my mind, and so in that sort of similar vein of you know, of both, you know, because I think both are equally important, you know, trying to remember the details visually of someone, but also remembering how they sounded too. And I'm so glad that sort of we live in the, you know, age of, you know, cell phones and voicemails that stay on your phone forever. Because I wouldn't, you know, I wouldn't give those up for anything. They're some of my most prized possessions. Um, so yeah, it's well, like I said, that scene did very much speak to me. I thought it was beautiful.
Yeah, no, I mean it's the heart. It's like I said, it's in many ways the heart of the movie. It's one of the things that shows you that this movie is ultimately still a very romantic and, you know, idealistic and hopeful movie, even when dealing with complicated subjects like grief and loss and, you know, resentment and fear about the future. You know, and it feels all the more real and authentic for
Yeah. This movie is also about time travel.
that. Yes.
No, I will say you know, I really liked that, you know, that final beat of the movie. You know, after they've had their big fight, I was like, is this gonna work? But it does.
Yeah. No,
Uh,
I love that they revisited that, you know, because like, you know, one of the recurring things about this movie, this entire series of movies has been the idea that, you know, moments folding in on themselves, different moments in time happening simultaneously. You know, this has been a core theme of Jesse's writing. You know, he talks about this constantly. And it's one of the reasons why he's so obsessed with ideas of time and perception and everything. And this movie ultimately builds into it by revisiting moments from the prior films, you know, and specifically the pivotal moment from the very first movie, Before Sunrise, when Jesse asked Céline to get off the train with him and took a huge risk. And they talk about that earlier in the movie when they're having the kind of the scene that's probably the most similar to where what the movies were like before, when they're having the walk to the hotel and they're revisiting, you know, conversations, bullshitting, as Jesse says. But so then Céline asks him about the idea that, you know, hey, if we were still, you know, if you were to meet me right now on a train, like, would you ask me to get off the train with you? And they both, and it becomes in a weird way a missed opportunity for connection, as opposed to the moment, as Jesse said, on game day when he actually did, you know, make that connection and she took that risk with him. Because at first, you know, Jesse like kind of equivocates, and then Celine's like, I just wanted you to say something romantic and then you blew it. And then Jesse turns it around on her and he's like, would you have gotten off the train with me? And she's like, no, of course not, I have people waiting for me. And it's, you know, and they play it as a joke and it still becomes like an intimate moment for them, but it's like all you really had to do there was say yes. And it just becomes like more of a complicated feeling, because it really underscores the idea that like that was such, like, if that moment hadn't happened, none of this entire relationship would never have happened, because it was such a chance encounter. But that makes it all the more special that when they revisit the idea that, as Jesse says, of time travel, you know, what did he say to her that got Céline off the train in the first place? The idea when he was talking about the idea that picture your flash forward 10 years, 20 years, and you're married, only that relationship doesn't have the same spark as that you once did. You start to blame your husband. You start to think about all the other guys in your life that you could have taken up with and what your life would be like if you had gone with one of them. Well, I'm one of those guys. This is me. So think of this as time travel. Think of this as a favor to your future self. And it wasn't exactly, it was 9 and 18 years for the two movies, but it's actually like, it's clear that like, this is kind of revisiting that idea of like, of Céline, questioning like, where do we stand at this moment? And Jesse has like the line where he's talking about like, I'm still that same guy. Like, despite all their equivocating earlier, it's like Jesse is still the 23-year-old, romantic who had asked Céline to get off the train with him. Céline is still the 23-year-old romantic who agreed to get off the train with Jesse. And the moments of connection that they have where they didn't feel, where they like shared something and didn't feel quite so alone, those moments were real. Those moments happened. And even if they've forgotten them, or it's been obfuscated by some of the bullshit of life, as Jesse says, it's still there. And I find it powerful that Jesse would bring the idea back of the time travel and the idea that, hey, like, we're like, that was our beginning. This is in danger of becoming our end, but it doesn't have to be, because he then takes it forward to the idea of having talked to her 82-year-old self, and that perhaps, planting the idea that we can get through this, we can survive this, our love is strong enough to have gone through this. And it seems like Céline is not going to play this game with him, but ultimately, like, she still wants to, she's still like, she's just, angry and frustrated and feeling lost. But ultimately, she takes that chance again. And it feels like almost a new beginning in that way. Like there's real danger. There's that moment when, after Jesse, kind of drops the pretensions of trying to make her laugh and basically just says, if you think I'm some dog who's going to keep coming back, you're wrong. But if you want true love, then this is it. This is real life. It's not perfect, but it's real. If you can't see it, then you're blind and I give up. He's not actually giving up there. He desperately wants her to connect. And there's that heartbreaking little moment where it seems like Céline is going to get up and leave the table. And Jesse almost recoils in like despair when that happens. But then she doesn't. Then she sits back down. And then she finally plays into his time travel idea. And that's the moment when you realize these people are going to be okay. And if anything, their relationship might be stronger for it. For having gone.
And it also revisits the earlier thing of, of her playing the part of the bimbo.
Bimbo, yes. Which again was also seeded in there for comedic effect, but it becomes a much more of an emotional, touchstone later.
Yeah, but it's also, there's also a dark edge to that. We can infer that maybe that's how she pictures this other woman, that, it's not said definitively, but it pretty much feels like Jesse is slept with this other woman. And I feel a little bit less sure when he throws it back in her face and accuses her. I'm like, well, maybe, but I'm not. But that feels like justification on his end. So, like, yeah, it's one of those things where it's like, yeah, things are far from perfect between them, but the movie ends in a place where they both seem, dedicated to actually, really trying. And yeah, well, like we've been saying, this is the movie that's steeped in like, what does it really mean to be in a relationship? And yeah, so it's, so much of this movie is heartbreaking, and and like we discussed earlier, we kind of jumped the gun a bit and talked all about the argument scene earlier on, but I would just to revisit it a bit, like, it was both I said it was riveting to watch, but it was also very difficult to sit through and heartbreaking. But the fact that they end in a place where it feels like they're going to be okay, it just makes it so it's all okay. But yeah, like I do want to say, like, oh, hold on a second. Sorry, Ron. Whew. Like, the entire movie is really well written, but like I feel like the movie deserved that screenplay nomination just for the extended argument scene alone, because it's just so amazing. And oh no, hold on a second. Sorry, I just smell popcorn, which means my dad's making popcorn. But no, it's just, it was so immaculately well crafted, and just to see that side of these characters, and where they're getting to really dig into sort of resentments that have been stewing, and you know and like I said, it just, I feel really conflicted when watching these scenes, because it's hard to watch, but also from a performance standpoint, I was like, oh man, they're really getting to dig deep into the stuff. And and that's why I was bringing up the part about the accusation of Jesse cheating, and there's that moment where she's complaining about the hotel room, and he says, I think it's sexy, and she's like, I bet you do.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's just really the edges are sharp, the knives are out.
It's a stark reminder of the fact that these are both deeply flawed characters. We love these characters. We've gone on this journey with them over the course of 18 years, effectively. But we always knew that they had moments where they were not they were flawed. We've seen Jesse's insecurity and his his tendency to not always want to engage in the most immediate moments of emotional intimacy, his tendency to make a joke instead. And we've seen Céline's tendency to get very wrapped up in her own anger and make leaps that sometimes might seem a little bit extreme, the fact Jesse's right. When she's talking about the fact that she's calling him out rightly of the fact that he is, telling her, he keeps saying, let's have an unemotional, rational conversation about this. And she's like, are you kidding? I'm actually being the rational one here. But then she also has a moment where she basically is like, the world is fucked by unemotional, rational men. And you're like, she's right. She has a point there. But then she makes the leap where she basically is like, oh, hey Cassie.
Hi, Cassie. You should absolutely watch these movies.
They're amazing, all three of them. But when she takes it to an extreme where she basically is she starts comparing it to the final solution, very rational thinking behind that, and it's just come on,
okay, you lost me there.
Yeah, exactly. Or even just the simple fact that when Jesse is trying to feel his way through to his son, and Céline shows incredible empathy towards him. But then she also has moments when, in anger, she's basically like, you know what I think you need to do? I think you need to move to Chicago. And and then he's like, are you crazy? Why are you suggesting this? Do you ever listen to yourself? And it becomes very, tense and charged. But also we see the strain that each of them is putting on that they're dealing with. Clearly Céline is very overworked and very stressed, and that's part of her frustration, because she talks about the fact that she doesn't have any time for herself anymore. and she used to write songs and on her guitar, and which is another nice callback, but she doesn't get to anymore. And Jesse has the line like, "I wish you would, I wish you would write songs." She's like, "I don't, but I." She's like, "But I can't." And then he has the hammer lines like, "I love the way you sing. I fucked up my whole life because of the way you sing," which is, a lovely callback to, the ending of the movie, but it also kind of recontextualizes it in the sense that like that was such a beautiful moment of intimacy, but he did effectively, fuck up his life because it led to this incredibly messy divorce. And
yeah, I was going to say there was a nicer way you could have put that.
Yeah.
No, Cassie, like by the same token, like I'm gonna say that any film that we're talking about on this channel, because I really only am talking about movies that I love. So yeah, I'm just like the fact that that I say this movie is really great, you should watch it, should not come as any kind of a shock whatsoever. Hi, Mother Ryan. I know today's been a bit quieter because we this was our first one back, and it's a sort of a lower, and I know not a lot of people have seen these movies compared to like the blockbusters and stuff that are out. Certainly like not on the scale of like the last 2 weeks we did this where we were talking about Logan and Deadpool and Wolverine. But yeah, it's kind of our quiet easing back in. And then since you guys are in the chat now, I don't know if you were in earlier, but next week we will be talking about the first 4 episodes of season 2 of The Rings of Power. So that'll be a bit more I think that'll be a bit more high profile. We might even get some people in the chat that we don't want. So we'll see how that goes. Yeah, I know, Cassie. I hear you.
Yeah.
And I do, and and we'll talk about that. And just because I have loved these first 3 episodes does not mean that they're flawless. There are things we will talk about. I don't want to get into it quite yet because once we start, there's a lot to say. But I have some conflicted feelings, about those things. But yeah, we're still gonna have loads of fun because there's so much good to talk about. Yeah. So what was I saying? Yeah. Thank you guys for tuning in though, and yeah, no, please. You guys missed earlier. We turned our mid-roll into a mini Rings of Power stream that it probably ran for like a good 20 minutes.
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah. So it's not you, Cassie. We're ready to jump. At the slightest provocation. But yeah, I feel like we're winding down on the discussion about the movie. Is there stuff, because like I said, we did talk a lot early on about the argument sequence. Is there anything that we haven't like dove into that you want to make sure we do?
I mean, we did kind of skip over the walk to the hotel, which again is the kind of the scene that is the most evocative of the other movies, and they even call that out, just the fact that like, how long has it been since we've had the opportunity to do this? But like, the reason I think it's important is because it does, that reestablishes their intimacy, and it shows, Céline even, mentions like the fact that she feels, close to Jesse when they're having that conversation and they're talking. And they cover some heavy, subjects in there, like we were in the Jesse's grandmother has passed away, and that he'll be attending the funeral, which they had set up earlier in the movie when he gets the text. But it's also there to plant the idea that, again, in contrast to the idea that like, oh, romantic relationships aren't supposed to last forever. Like when he mentioned his grandmother and grandfather, he's like, how long were they married? 74 years. And she's like, fuck, are you going to be able to put up with me for another 56 years? And he's like, I am looking forward to it. And, you know, and that feels like very real and very, you know, true to where they are, because they are, you know, not like, you know, they are still the love of each other's life. And they talked about the idea of romanticizing the idea of dying with the person you love, or Céline brings that up with her allusion to like, you know, the people of Pompeii who had like been buried under molten ash. But she also like mentions like if it had been our first night, like if we had died there together, like I could have, you know, died happy, but now I'd like to live. And it's, you know, and again, it's funny. Like there are a lot of little moments like that. Also the scene in the church, the scene with the where they talk about the fact that like the, you know, that she starts making jokes in the church and Jesse's trying to get her to calm down. She's like, oh, I forgot you're actually a closet Christian. Is it bad to make blowjob jokes in the church? And she kind of like teases him about that. And I will just say, just as a note, because we'd mentioned earlier, I think that like Jesse and Céline were like married. They're actually not. We learned that in this scene that basically that they are living together. They're committed to each other in a long-term partnership, but they actually never got married. And their kids want them to be married, but they decided not to be, which is another thing that makes it feel more fraught, because the idea that like if they're not married, it's easier for them to, you know, separate their lives and everything. But ultimately, that's not going to be necessary. And that committed relationship is, you know, they are very committed to each other. You know, they are very much, you know, they're husband and wife in spirit, if not in like legal terms.
Yeah, I will say I talked earlier about the fact that my mom and dad separated in like 2008. Actually, they divorced. They full on divorced. And then when they got back together, they never really remarried. But it was just like it didn't matter, because it's like they were husband and wife. You know, I think they just didn't want to go through all that, and that was their personal decision. And like, it never felt like anything was different. You know. So yeah, that's you know, that's a decision that's, you know, up to the individual people, and it's perfectly fine. I think in every other respect, they're, you know, they may not have an official piece of paper that says, oh, they're husband and wife, but it seems pretty clear that, you know, they're just as committed to one another, you know, more so than many married people. So yeah. But it was interesting to have that be made clear, and you're right, it does kind of add a little bit, like, but also the fact that they have kids together too, and it's very clear that they care very much about that. And like Jesse is so tormented over, you know, the decisions he's made that's led to being away from his son, that you can tell he would never, ever, 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 you know, do that to his daughters.
Yeah.
Just because he's had that experience, and he's dealing with the fallout from that. So like, so when she says, "Oh, you should just, you know, move back to the U.S.," and she's angry at him, and he's like, "What? Are you out of your mind? You know, I would never be able to leave you and the girls." And yeah, so.
Yeah, their relationship with their daughters. Again, the daughters aren't major characters in the movie, but they're central figures because they are so important to Jesse and Céline and their relationship. And in particular, in that there's this in one of the kind of the like lulls in their argument where they're, you know, more, you know, intimate and like empathetic towards each other. You know, Céline talks about like the, you know, her struggles with learning how to become a mother, you know, and the fact that she's like, when they were born, I had no idea what to do. People expect women to have this instinct that kicks in, but in first I like I was doing everything wrong. And like, your heart is breaking for her in that moment, because, you know, her voice cracks when she says, I loved them so much and I was doing everything wrong. And she was doing it, as she also points out, like, she was doing a lot of it on her own because Jesse was constantly away fighting in many cases to, you know, for Henry's custody. And so she relays the fact that, like, when he called her to ask her how her day was, she could barely, you know, tell him the truth because she felt embarrassed. And it's one of the reasons why she's so committed to the idea that, like, she's not going to be reduced to like a housewife. She's going to have her own career and her own life. And she's always had that strong, passionate feminist ideal. But she is a mother, and she does love her daughters more than anything. And, you know, she's finding it difficult to balance those two, as so many women and people do in the world. But she's doing it. And Jesse, in a moment of like real empathy and great, you know, is like telling her, like, no, you did great. You know, did so well, like helping to like raise our daughters. But it's just something that she's feeling insecure about in many ways. And it is another source of conflict for them and their relationship, even though they both love their daughters and they love each other. You know, if this stuff is hard. And it's another element of the movie that just feels so true and real and authentic, because it doesn't devolve into a blame game or a screaming match. It's like they both have their North Star of their committed relationship to each other and their daughters. They're just like, they're struggling with the details. And ultimately the challenge is not to lose sight of the bigger picture, which ultimately they don't.
Yeah. I will say one thing that I found, you know, like something that I really wanted to know more details about, because it kind of leaves a question mark over to, you know, what completely is driving her decision in this regard. But I'd love to know more about the sort of conflict with the job that she's about to accept, and you know, the guy she'll be working with, who clearly sounds like a dick. But it kind of flips back and forth between, like, you know, she kind of lands by the end of the movie on, you know, sort of saying it is her dream job, but based on everything we know about her, it doesn't quite sound like it would be. And is part of that because that's when they're still being combative towards one another, and is she going to be happy if she goes in that direction, or is it just one of those things where sometimes we sort of, you know, let go of sort of our dream aspirations and try and go for a more realistic, you know, sense of stability, you know. And I feel like that's one of those things that we don't really get a final answer on, like how much of it is, does she really want that, and how much of it is she feels like she has to be more quote unquote realistic.
Yeah, I'm actually really glad you brought that up, because that has been an undercurrent, not only in this movie, but all three movies. You know, in one of the very first scenes in Before Sunrise, when Céline is talking about, like, the fact that even from a young age, her parents were kind of trying to take her fanciful ambitions for her career and turn them into something more practical. Like, she would say she wanted to be an actress, and her dad would say TV newscaster. I want to be a writer, journalist. I want a shelter for abandoned, you know, pets, veterinarian. And then we had seen in the second movie that she went on to become she is basically working for a nonprofit. She's fighting the good fight. She's trying to, as she says, enjoy the details of actually helping people and fighting these battles. You know, and she had worked for the government before, but then she hated it, so she went and did something else. And that's why it's so interesting that in this movie, she's looped back to the possibility of going to work for the government again and working for this Remy, who, as you said, sounds like a kind of a abusive dick in the workplace, because she's so frustrated with essentially being like not getting those results. You know, the reason she's considering this job is because she basically worked for half a year to get these like wind turbines, you know, set up for clean energy, and then all of a sudden a bunch of NIMBYs were like, not in my backyard, and they canceled it. And so she's like, screw this, we need laws. And Jesse like is telling her like, don't make a snap decision about this in this moment. But it's clearly not a snap decision. It's something she's struggling with because it doesn't sound like she's going to be like enjoy this work as much. But could she get more results that way? And when she describes it as her dream job, it's not because of like she would love working there. It's because she could actually do the things that she wants to do more easily. And so it's become, and you know, and when Jesse raises the possibility, could you find a comparable job in the U.S.? She's like, are you kidding me? No. So that's another thing that feels very, you know, authentic in its conflict. And even though we don't get a clear answer on like whether or not she will ultimately take that job, because that's not really the story of the movie, it is essential that like that is what's driving a lot of her frustration throughout the movie. It's not just her relationship with Jesse that, you know, she's having some conflict with. It's her frustrations at work. And, you know, the fact that because Jesse, you know, even though Céline calls him out, like not about him not wanting to have a more stable job, like that's one of her like weeks. He's basically like, I teach 2 courses a year at the fucking American school, and yes, I write, and I go on contemplative walks under the olive trees, but my writing isn't a hobby, you know. And this is more just Celine's undercurrent of like not wanting to be put in a box of, now that she has kids, that she's a wife and a mother and that's all she is. And as just in one of the moments of empathy that Jesse shows to her, he tells her like, it would be easier, you know, calling back to the Sylvia Plath thing, it would be easier to fit your head into a toaster than turn you into anything submissive. And it's notable that like that plays into the idea that like, even though, you know, they have that fun dynamic where she like pretends to be a bimbo when he pretends to be super attracted to her. Like that's not who Céline is. And clearly like her feistiness and her like spirit and her like indomitable will and her like refusal to submit to that kind of, you know, hierarchy is one of the reasons Jesse fell in love with her in the first place. And he would never want to.
Yeah. Oh man. Just I'll say it again. That's you know, that 40 odd minute scene is intense, and yeah, it's like I was saying before, man, it's just a testament to the kick-ass writing of this film that we're riveted for, you know, an extended argument scene, and we can't really look away. Now it's, yeah, I thought this was just the whole film was just amazing. And even though like I do feel like, you know, like I was saying before, where it's not quote unquote my favorite film of the trilogy, just because of the nature of the movie, I think it's so amazingly well made and put together, and you know, at the risk of repeating myself, it's the film that the third chapter had to be, you know. It feels true to what's come before, and yeah, and it sort of ends in a place where like I said earlier, you know, trilogy question mark, you know, but I'd almost be more satisfied if it does just end right here, just because, you know, it's this movie kind of brings their relationship into a more sort of more grounded, realistic, you know, portrait of such things, but it still ends in a good place. And I don't necessarily like, I'm just so scared that any further films would just feel the need to end in tragedy. And I'm like, we don't need that. let's just keep them right here.
Yeah, no, I alluded to earlier the fact that like I rarely felt more anxious, you know, or nervous watching a movie because, you know, at that final argument, all I was thinking was like, please God, don't break up, don't break up, don't break up, don't break up. And then it looks like they might break up, and then they come back together, and the catharsis that I felt when I realized like, oh no, they're actually going to be okay. Just it was so overwhelming and so much of a relief that was basically like bottle. My initial instinct was bottle that feeling, that like this is the place to leave it, just leave it here. But that if they ultimately, one of the reasons I love this trilogy so much is that each individual movie feels like a specific moment in these character lives, but collectively they enhance each other and reflect upon each other and recontextualize each other, and it ultimately feels like a larger, complete story. That's why I think it's one of the best trilogies I've ever seen. And if it needs to be like, and I'm not necessarily like, I'm of two minds of the fact that I could be like, on the one hand, I would be happy if we got, ongoing stories about these characters forever, and I don't think it would diminish this trilogy in any way. Like, if as long as Ethan Hawke and Julie Delpy and Richard Linklater have something to say, if they happen to 27 years from now be like, we actually have another idea about where to visit these characters, I'm going to be first in line to see it. But I'm also content with leaving the characters here if they're like, we've told this story, we've told, this trilogy is now going to kind of stand on its own. I think it's about as perfect of a place to leave it as you as they could have ever envisioned, because the one thing that we had never seen Jesse and Céline have to do after the first two movies was go through a trial by fire like this, and now that they did and they survived it, it makes me feel like they can handle anything. And I know that like if there were to be future movies in this series, they would not lose that spirit, they would not like reveal that actually, no, Jesse and Céline ended up breaking up, years down the line. I think it would revisit, it introduced a new conflict, but I think that it ultimately, they showed us in this movie that the love that these two characters have is strong enough to stand the test of time, which for a trilogy about, really the idea of love over time is about as perfect of a place as you could have to leave it, I'd say.
And I will say, like, just the nature of these movies is that you really could make the next film anytime you want. It's nothing, to borrow from this movie. There is no ticking clock.
Yeah.
Because the actors are still relatively young. I mean, Jesse's like what 40, 41 in this movie, and they're talking about getting older. I'm like, no, don't talk about getting older. I'm 40. You're still young. And yeah, it's been like 10 years on now, but in the grand scheme of things, the actors are still younger, and and so they've still got plenty of time. If they come around to a story, later on down the line. I actually think it's an interesting next place to go to have a larger gap of time, and it would actually be interesting to be from, from my perspective, who, it came to this movie even in these movies, even long after this film was made, it would be interesting to actually have that experience of having, come to these movies, but then get to experience the next chapter years down the line, and get to sort of, really experience that. It's actually, I will say that I know that Richard Linklater won Oscars for his movie Boyhood, which was a highly ambitious project. The big thing that kind of didn't click for me on that was the fact that, okay, like they filmed parts of that at various points in all the actors' lives, but it was all released at one time. For me, what makes these more effective, even though, yes, I did just see all three of them at relatively the same time, but I'm aware of the fact that these movies came out at certain points down the line. Even though I didn't see them, I remember specifically when Before Sunset and Before Midnight when they came out, and the sort of impact they were making in sort of critical circles and the award circuit, and and even just fans of the movie. That they were a big hit in an Oscar forum that I frequented years ago. And I remember when Before Sunset came out, and and people in that particular forum were like gushing about the movie, and so I've been aware of them and the impact that they made over the years, even if I hadn't seen them. And there is something different about that when something like this gets dropped every so often, and it's just about these characters' lives, and getting to follow them as they age, as the actors age. Um, that I think that these movies are probably the um, you know for me they're the more effective version of that. Which is not to say anything bad about the film Boyhood. I think I understand why that won a lot of awards, but for me, I think these films were the more interesting experimentation with that kind of storytelling.
Yeah,
That's just my personal take on it.
no, I mean, I agree. I mean, I really like Boyhood, but I think that these movies are special. They really feel like truly lightning in a bottle captured 3 times over the course of 18 years. Because the first movie, there were no expectations for it. No one knew what it was going to be. It was Ethan Hawke was, had been a hit, in certain act, but he wasn't like the established actor he is now. And Julie Delpy was just a relative unknown at the time. And like that movie, like, was really just made as a personal, like, experience, as Richard Linklater had talked about, inspired by his interactions with the woman, Amy Learhart, who, as I had mentioned back in our first one, this movie is dedicated to at the end because she had tragically passed away shortly before the first movie was released. But then it became its own thing. They've talked about the fact that they basically, nobody was asking for a second movie. I mean, some people may have, but it wasn't going to be considered a financial hit, so it took a while for them to build up to it, but they got the movie made because they had an interesting idea, and then it was a tremendous success, but then that could have been it. And they had mentioned basically usually the reason that there was like 9 years between each of them is that usually they felt like we said what we needed to say for about 5 years, and then we start to get an idea, and then we workshop that idea for 2 years, and we write the movie, and then we're ready to make it. And I just love the symmetry that all the movies are separated by 9 years, but that was more of an accident than by a design. But it in many ways like the writing of the movies themselves, which feels like very like spontaneous, but it wasn't. It is in fact very rigorously rehearsed and planned and rewritten. That this is almost the opposite of that. That like these feel like perfect distillations of moments in time, but there was a spontaneity to it that, frankly, I don't know if it can be recaptured by other movies or that have tried to do similar things. I've never seen it done this well. And that's one reason why I just consider these movies, all 3 of them, to be a gift, and why they're some of my favorite movies ever, because it is really hard to overstate just how incredibly difficult it is to tell a story like this over the course of 18 years and have it feel not only like individually distinct, but all of a piece like this. That's why I found this movie in particular, even though it's not my favorite of the trilogy, to be such a resounding triumph, because it feels like the right punctuation for the story of Jesse and Céline for now, And if they want to revisit it in the future, I'm happy to, I will always be happy to go back to these characters. But I also know that like their lives have been lived, and their lives are ongoing. And if we ever get to see any more of it, it will also be a gift. But if we don't, what we saw was enough for me to consider this one of the most beautiful love stories of all time. So
And I will say, if there's a big through line between these films and the film I just referenced, Boyhood, it's that Richard Linklater has an outstanding amount of patience as a filmmaker because none of these films could be made without that kind of patience. That's one thing why I said I understood why Boyhood won those awards, is because that kind of a project has an ambitious scope that, like, you have to have patience to actually pull something like that off. But I think the same is true here of waiting, between so many years between, each film, and sort of waiting for that inspiration to hit for the next one. And also just pulling it off, because, like, when do you ever get a trilogy of films when the films are like really low budget independent films? It's so unique in sort of the history of film. It's I remember being like, something comparable was this was before. Now it's like, it feels like everything gets a sequel, but I remember when in like 2006 or something like that, they announced that the film Elizabeth was getting a sequel. I'm like, what? I'm like, why is there being? That's not a sort of the kind of movie that seems like it would get a sequel. And that was like a big award-winning, costume drama slash, historical epic. And these movies seem even more implausible to get sequels. And so the fact that it's been, a trilogy of these films, and it just feels like such a unique, weird, thing that shouldn't have happened, but it did. And yeah, it does feel like the antithesis of everything going on, especially in modern day cinema. Not the sequel part of it, but the the smaller independent, film turning into, a sort of mini franchise.
Yeah,
Even though that feels like a dirty word for these movies, because it's not at all what it is, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, it's an ongoing story. It is a trilogy. You're right. It's calling it a franchise doesn't seem that right, because it is an independent film and it's not based on like pre-existing characters. But like, it's also, like, as I think I had mentioned in the like, these movies are a remarkable success for so many reasons. Not only because I think they're creatively brilliant and like and true artistic achievements, but like, these movies made money, like, not a ton, but like, they were made, each of them was made for about $3 million, and all of them made about like $15 to $20 million. That's a success, in this day and age where, people are like freaking out about budgets of movies reaching like $300 million and needing to make almost $1 billion to turn a profit. Like, this is another way to do it, they are.
Love you, Cass.
Bye, Cass.
All right,
Thanks.
talk to you later.
But yeah, it's just like, again, it wasn't made to be like a creative, it wasn't made to like make money. It was made because these artists had something to say, and they said it over the course of 18 years with these 3 films. But these movies could just be like little underrated gems that like people go to bat for online, because you're like, nobody's seen this movie, and like, but these movies have a fan base. They have endured over the course of, since they came out, and they still feel like, I still encounter people, like, not as many people have seen them. Most of the people who I have encountered who have seen these movies, they love them, and I had talked about like not wanting to sometimes being hesitant to recommend these movies to people because I'm not sure if everyone will be on their wavelength, because they're different kinds of movies. But if you open your heart to them, like, I just think that the journey that they can take you on is remarkable and unique and so incredibly rewarding. So if that's something that you're willing to, give a chance to, much like Jesse and Céline taking that chance to get off the train with one another and it leading to the love of a lifetime, it's a chance well worth taking.
Yeah, I'm just very happy that I've finally gotten to see these movies, because again, the timing was just never right. Because what year was it that Before Sunset came out? That was
2004.
2004, and I feel like I feel like it was probably that meme online from Umbrella Academy with with the two characters passing each other by in the cars. I feel like that's probably me in this movie, because I was just starting to get into like independent filmmaking in 2004, but I don't think I was quite there yet for a movie that small. And so, and in fairness, a lot of the smaller movies that I did watch in 2004 was because they had like actors that I was really big fans of. Like, The Aviator had DiCaprio, Finding Neverland had Johnny Depp, Closer had Natalie Portman, who I was desperately in love with. But those more sort of what we'll call superficial reasons for watching those movies were opened my eyes to that. And also the fact that I was really into Oscar watching at the time, because with Lord of the Rings having been such a big thing with the awards in the years beforehand. And so being in tune with that sort of award season buzz and all that was starting to open my eyes to these movies, which is probably why I heard about this film at all. But I wasn't quite there yet to watch a movie like this. And so if I feel like if this movie had come out like a year later, I probably would have seen all of these movies, years ago. And but it didn't happen, and instead I got to see them this year. So here we are, and the experience has been very, very rewarding, and I've been happy to watch them. And part of the joy of actually waiting until now to see them is that a little less so with this one, but especially the first two movies were real nice time capsules back to years when I was younger, and and definitely feel of their times, and in a really good way.
Yeah, the movies feel of their times, but the story that they are telling is a timeless story in many ways. That's one of the elements that it's not present in the script itself, but Ethan Hawke has talked about in interviews, the idea that when they set this movie in Greece, and it's dealing with ideas of love and commitment, they talked about the idea of like the Greek god Eros being the oldest and youngest god, and the fact that a story like this, it feels as old as time, but it also feels vibrant and new, because every time you fall in love again, it feels like you're being reborn. And they kind of left that as the subtext, but it really feels like these movies are like, there will always be stories like this about people finding moments of connection with one another, and that connection enduring. And that's why for me personally, like the relevance of these movies is never going to fade. Some movies, you see it at the right time, and and it's because of the circumstances in your life that you feel like that was the right movie for the right time. But sometimes when you revisit it, it doesn't, hold up quite as well. These movies have not only held up, my love for them has grown stronger every time I rewatch them. And they're movies I feel confident in saying that I will always love, no matter how many years in the future I revisit them, because the story just is that pure and timeless and ever renewing.
Yeah, I mean, there are certain movies that are just like that. My parents had to come to terms with the fact that for me that was Lord of the Rings, and no matter how much they wished, I never did tire of them. but yeah, no, and such experiences are just so so wonderful, and just like those are special, you know, um, experiences to be held on to, and when it happens, it's beautiful. Um, so yeah, I think with that we'll wrap up. I just had two little things. This is digressing a bit, but since I brought it up earlier, and I you know, I was mentioning the movies that I watched when I was starting to get into like independent films and stuff. And one of them that I mentioned was the movie Closer. And I said I'd watched that for Natalie Portman, which I did, of course. But one of the great things about that movie and that year, in addition to another film, which it's so funny, that one of them, Closer, had Natalie Portman. The other one was a very different movie, King Arthur, which had, of course, Keira Knightley. But both of those films in that year introduced me to Mr. Clive Owen, who just like knocked my socks off, especially in Closer. And since then, he's just become one of my favorite actors. But it's just so interesting. I think that was so far back now. It's 2024, so 20 years ago. Very interesting. And the other thing on a different, on a very different note that I just want to mention was, let's see, where was it? She's not here anymore, but Cassie, I wanted to thank you. I was talking about the fact that every movie that we talk about on this channel, I'll say, hey, that's great, and you should see it. I said that in a joking manner, but then you said, but my recommendation should be trusted, and I just want to thank you for that. It means a lot. Not everybody will agree with you, but it means a lot that you said that. Yeah, so I think that's about it for me. And any final thoughts?
No, just I want to thank you, John, for agreeing to talk about these movies as a full trilogy. We had done the first one as kind of like my birthday stream, as like I get to pick the movie even if John hasn't seen it, and like if that could have been theoretically it if you hadn't responded to the movie as well as you did. But I'm so grateful that you did like it and that you gave the ongoing opportunity to talk about all three, especially before sunset, because these movies are some of the most important movies in my entire life, and they've shaped my love for cinema and my perspective on life in many ways. And it's rare to be able to talk about that kind of thing in such detail because, again, not everybody's seen these movies. But so I'm very grateful that we had the opportunity to discuss them, and hopefully you found the journey rewarding, as you said, and I'm so glad because it means that we got to share something special with these films.
Yeah, no, I absolutely did. My only regret is that something that we talked about earlier, which was that I did not take the opportunity last month to pick up the box set when it was on sale through Barnes and Noble. It's because I couldn't find it in stores, and I kept meaning to, potentially order it online. I missed that, and so I would have spent $50 on it. Not quite sure I want to spend $100 on it, so that might just wait for next year, or the next time there's a sale. And yeah, but I think these movies have earned a place. Maybe by then, Criterion will decide to put out 4K editions, and I can go for that instead. But we'll see. No, I enjoyed the heck out of these movies, and thank you for recommending them. And also, like, I'm just glad that it gave you an opportunity just to to talk about them, because I totally, it's the whole reason I started this channel. It's just so that I could talk about my love for movies, and and especially why it's really kind of been key for me on this channel to, and it's been difficult to, I feel like I've kind of struck gold twice. Once when AR was my co-host, and now when you've agreed to, because it's hard to find people to come on and talk about, all the sort of different movies that I'm passionate about. Because when you invite guests on, you can get a couple movies that you're really psyched about discussing, but it's hard to like get someone who will come on and say, well, you go with me on this diversion into this lesser known thing. And so the fact that you've been willing to do that with me, it was only fair to extend that to you. And it was a really rewarding experience for me. So yeah.
Yeah. And yep, on that note, as we alluded to earlier, this marks the 1 year, that I've been your official co-host. I had been on the channel before previously to discuss mostly Keira Knightley movies. But our first stream with me as your official co-host was I think it was August 26th last year, when we were talking about the first 2 episodes of Ahsoka. And even though we didn't plan it this way, like, this feels like a fun, commemorative thing for like the one year edition. So let's keep it going, and here's to many more, my friend.
Yeah, and yeah, I feel like we're starting off year 2 in the best possible way, because we're gonna start next week, Lord of the Rings, then Natalie Portman, Black Swan, and then Keira Knightley and Anna Karenina. We're hitting all the big notes.
This channel has certain touchstones that we will always revisit. So, we gotta get our Knights of Keira and our Lord of the Rings fixes in, and Natalie Portman as well. That'll be a Star Wars adjacent stream. We'll get back to Star Wars eventually, but we've done a lot of Star Wars, so we can take.
Yeah. Oh, and has there been some drama going on in the Star Wars world?
Yep, R.I.P. The Acolyte, which again was a show that we discussed on this channel, and which both of us had some complicated feelings about, but which we both ultimately did really both enjoy, and I was sorry to see it.
Yeah. We have a couple minutes until we actually hit the 3-hour mark, so I think I will say my piece on that real quick. It wasn't my favorite Star Wars show, but it was absolutely a show that deserved to, at the very least, finish its story. And I know it meant a lot to a lot of people for various reasons, whether that was for the story itself or for what it meant for representation, and or both, and I think, there's a lot about it that stings for some of those reasons. And like, I say it wasn't my favorite Star Wars series, but I was still really psyched to see where that story was going to go in season 2. And, especially, with those teases we got of Darth Plagueis and Yoda and, all this stuff, and the fact that the performances were so great. And having just started watching The Good Place, I'm now such a huge Manny, Jacinto fan. But like, you mentioned The Good Place when we were talking about his performance, on the stream, and it's like, yeah, I can now see how like the initial character that we're fed and the acolyte, kind of, goes along with, what he's sort of more typically known for, and what a swerve, that turn is. And so I would have loved to see, uh, his character arc, and, you know, and just, I just, yeah, it's just one of those things where it sucks, and I hate what it says about the, sort of the state of things,
Yeah.
And it sends a very bad message, in my opinion. So uh, yeah, I'm not gonna hide my feelings about it. Like, I'm very disappointed that
Yeah.
it's happened, and yeah, there's no other way to put it. I think it's a really bad thing that the show was canceled,
Yeah.
and
Yeah,
yeah.
and I also share all those feelings. I love Star Wars so much. I loved that show, even though it challenged me at times. And I think that the fact that it seems to have emboldened some of the people who were really speaking out in really terrible and offensive ways about the show is incredibly unfortunate. Not to say nothing about the fact that it was very important to so many people for representation purposes. To be honest, the only reason I'm not more crushingly disappointed that it was canceled is the fact that I think it's part of a larger trend where I do feel like the streaming bubble has kind of burst, and I think that live action Star Wars shows on Disney Plus might be on their way out, to be honest, after Andor season 2. So
I'm not as I don't feel on quite the same level as you do about that. I don't think it's going away. I think there's going to be less of it.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's completely going away.
Yeah, I just don't think there's going to be a blank check anymore. Like
Yeah.
they had a ton of Marvel and Star Wars shows when they were trying to launch Disney Plus. Now it feels like there's some belt tightening going on, and I was very worried for the Acolyte from the moment I heard that the budget for the show was $180 million. That made me feel like this show is going to have to really do huge numbers to justify its ongoing continuation, and it sounds like it didn't hit that threshold. And I do think that was probably the main reason it was canceled, rather than the toxic backlash. But the toxic backlash clearly didn't help, because it, by permeating into the ether, it may have, tamped down on the show's audience. So it's just an unfortunate situation.
It drives me up the wall, because also, to me, it just doesn't, like, especially because there's so many things that to me, like, yes, if you look at it from a business standpoint, yes, I get why it makes sense that that they canceled it, but it's like, because the show was well received by serious people. Obviously its fan base was very passionate. And like, the biggest thing for me is, like, it was the first, live action real High Republic series. And the fact that so much has been put into the High Republic, like, you think they'd at least want to finish off the series. One more season. It makes as little sense to me as the cancellation of Age of Resistance did, because, like, they already had all the puppets and the sets, and like it's like, you're actually just, you put a lot of money into all this stuff and you're just kind of throwing that out the window instead of it like at least allowing for a graceful exit, you know? And the fact that's, you know, and not that the High Republic is done for, the books are still going to continue to be published and it's going to continue there. But it just seems like for the first series set in, you know, in that era, you wouldn't want to just unceremoniously throw it out. And it's just, I'm very like, yeah, I don't know. I'm very frustrated. I'm very confused. I'm very like, so much of it doesn't make sense to me. And yeah, I'm just going to repeat myself, but that's basically where I am.
Yeah, it's just unfortunate that it seems like it's not creative, you know, ideas that are driving the collapse of the streaming bubble. It's market forces, you know, not to even open up a separate box, but the whole like what happened with season 2 of House of the Dragon, where they had a 10-episode order and then basically they were told late in the process cut 2 episodes from this show. Which, you know, led to some controversy. It's just like, it feels like everyone is being forced to, you know, make decisions that are not as not in the
which
best
on that subject though, I do want to make very clear that I think that the creatives behind House of the Dragon handled that like with extreme skill.
I agree.
And like for me, that does not change my opinion that I think season 2 House of the Dragon was one of the best seasons of anything Game of Thrones related.
Yeah.
And I feel like, you know, I hate the narrative that's going on, you know, about that. I'm like, yes, it's, that sucks that happened. That absolutely should not have happened. But what they delivered us was still absolutely incredible, unless all you're looking from the show is nonstop action and dragon battles. You know, but
yeah, no, I think that they did a remarkable job, even given the limitations. It could have been even more incredible if they'd gotten to tell the story as they wanted to. And someone should tell George R. R. Martin that before he writes his whatever stupid blog post he's gonna be gifting us with in the next few weeks.
I so don't want to end the stream on me being really pissy, you know, but it's like, I'm not going to lie, I am so close to being done with George.
Oh, George.
Like, even if he's going to talk about, even if what he's actually going to write is laying into HBO as opposed to the show itself, I'm just going to say it. He dropped a gigantic pile of shit with no further explanation. And that really pissed me off. Okay, so I did end the stream being pissy. Sorry, that's the way I feel.
I mean, I agree. And that's about the only thing he's been dropping recently. Because guess what he's not dropping? You know. You all know.
Yeah, it's really
he ain't dropping the Winds of Winter, people. It's never coming.
Yeah, no, I've like, sorry everybody to end being really ranty, but like, I used to be of the opinion that the book, that Winds of Winter would at least actually come. I don't believe that anymore. I think The Song of Ice and Fire is a 5-book series, and a 5-book series it'll remain. You know, I'm not saying this because I'm one of those people that's like impatient and I'm like, George, you shouldn't do anything else. I'm just like, this is the way it is. And as two people who love the entirety of Game of Thrones, I think you and I are quite content, you know, with that reality, but I know a lot of people aren't. But I don't know. I'm yeah, sorry. God, this ended on such a sour note. Thankfully, nobody's watching. But for those of you who come to this later and have issues with with any of this. Sorry, but had to go there. Yeah. Anyway, so the state of things in sort of television entertainment is pretty crappy right now, which just makes me appreciate all the more when we get something really great. And we're going to talk about one of those things next week, which is Rings of Power, which is one of the most glorious television productions that's ever been made. I think I saw somebody mention on social media this week that like it actually looks like, you know, it looks like what it costs. You know, it's all of that money is being put on screen, and it's just has to be like the most fantastic, you know, and beautiful looking television show that's probably ever been made. And yeah, and so we're gonna gush some more about that next week. But yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I've dug myself a hole on many topics that in the past 5 minutes. So do you have anything more graceful to end this stream?
No, I mean, I'll just say that like we talk about things that we love on this channel. We share many common things that we love. You know, we love these movies, the Before trilogy. We love the Rings of Power. We're going to be very positive on that. But we are not, you know, perfect angelic people, you know, who have positive feelings about everything. Sometimes we let our frustrations slip, and we kind of let our frustrations slip with the state of streaming here at the end. So I apologize for that. We don't want anyone to feel like excluded or like we got off topic. But just, you know, it was a natural conversation, one that we've been having, you know, off camera as well as on. So you know, that's not the vibe we want. So we're gonna settle back down, and I'm just gonna say, I love this movie. Thank you for everyone who joined us on this journey through the Before trilogy. And please join us next week for the Rings of Power, where we will gush at length about something else that we love very dearly.
Oh, yeah, and you know, we're gonna talk at length about a lot of things. I think like the first big thing I'm gonna get off my chest is like what an absolute godsend of a performer that Charlie Vickers is as Sauron, because I like that's one of those things that I never thought like we'd get this kind of a story with showing Sauron in this way, because for years he was just a flaming eyeball. And it's been one of the great things about this series.
Yeah.
But yeah, we'll dive into more of that next week. You know, thank you both to Cassie and to Mother Royne for stopping in. We know this was kind of a more under the radar stream, especially since it was our first one back after 3 weeks. But for those of you who maybe come to it later, thank you very much, and I hope to see you guys next week as we discuss season 2 of the Rings of Power. Until then, have a great night.
To passing through.
Yeah.